It is a strange and unsettling thing to be haunted by a mystery that no one of your time can even define. To watch a creeping, invisible dread empty a village, to see a neighbor, hale and hearty at sunrise, become a blackened, delirious husk by sunset, and to have absolutely no framework for why. This was the reality of the 14th century. Before the microscope, before germ theory, the enemy that was coming had no name, no shape, and no rules. It was, to the people of this time, a supernatural event, a divine judgment, a poison. Carried on the air itself, they blamed the alignment of the planets, the corruption of the water, the glance of an infected person. But they could never, ever have imagined the truth, that the engine of their destruction was a living thing, a microscopic bacterium riding in the blood of a flea. I'm glad you're here. Wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As you settle in, feel free to post your location and local time in the comments. It's always a quiet comfort to know where in the world we are all listening from, sharing this space together. And so, our story begins not with a cough or a swelling, but with a feeling of profound, unshakable certainty. The world of the 1340s was, in its own way, perfectly understood. Every person, from the lowest peasant to the Pope himself, knew precisely how the universe worked. God was in his heaven, the king was on his throne, and the earth was the unmoving center of all creation. The rhythms of life were dictated by the sun and the church bell. Sickness, when it came, was a personal affair, an imbalance within your own body. The great medical minds of the age, drawing on wisdom passed down from the ancient Greeks, believed all of life was governed by four essential fluids: the humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Were you too hot and wet? You had a surplus of blood. Too cold and dry? An excess of black bile, leading to melancholy. Treatment was logical, if entirely wrong. You were bled with leeches to reduce the blood, or given herbs to make you vomit and expel the bad bile. This was a world that made sense. And then, from the very edge of the map, that sense began to unravel. The first whispers were just that, travelers' tales from the far, far east, so fantastical they were barely believed. Stories of storms of fire, of earthquakes swallowing cities, of a pestilence that left no survivors. But these were tales from the land of Cathay, modern-day China, a place as mythical to a medieval European as the moon. They were dismissed. But the force behind those rumors was already in motion. This force was, of course, Yersinia pestis, a bacterium of almost unfathomable efficiency. But the people of the 14th century had no way to see it. Their known enemy was miasma, literally, bad air. This was the prevailing scientific theory. They believed that disease was a noxious vapor, a corruption of the atmosphere that emanated from rotting matter, stagnant swamps, or even from the ground itself after an earthquake. The Paris medical faculty, commissioned by the King of France, would later write a definitive report blaming a specific astrological event. A triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the house of Aquarius in 1345. This, they concluded with absolute authority, had drawn up evil vapors from the earth. It's easy for us to scoff, armed with our modern knowledge, but in their framework, it was a perfectly rational scientific explanation. And this leads to one of the great historiographic mysteries of the plague. The official doctrine was miasma, The treatment was to burn aromatic woods, to carry flowers to your nose, to ring church bells, to scatter the air. Yet, the actions of the people tell a different story. Almost immediately, cities began to lock their gates. People fled from the sick. Magistrates in ports like Venice turned away ships, ordering them to wait offshore. This is not the behavior of people who think the air itself is poisoned. This is the behavior of people who suspect, on some deep, intuitive level, that the disease is spreading from person to person. This conflict is fascinating. Did the common folk, watching their families die, develop a common sense theory of contagion that was far more accurate than the learned ramblings of their doctors? The mystery is how this folk knowledge coexisted with the scientific miasma theory. Perhaps they reconciled it by believing the sick produced the miasma from their breath and pores, making them walking sources of toxic air. The world they inhabited was also physically primed for disaster. The climate had been changing. The warmth of the high Middle Ages, a period of bountiful harvests and booming populations, was over. The 14th century had seen the beginning of what we now call the Little Ice Age. Winters were longer, summers cooler and wetter. And just a generation before, from 1315 to 1317, Europe had endured the Great Famine. It rained and rained and rained. Crops failed everywhere. Seed grain rotted in the fields. Millions died of starvation, and those who survived were left weakened, their immune systems compromised. The population was stressed, hungry, and clustered together in newly crowded walled cities with sanitation that would horrify a modern observer. The streets were open sewers, filled with animal and human waste. It was a perfect storm, a world made of tinder, waiting for a single, microscopic spark. That spark, which had been incubating for centuries in the quiet grasslands of Central Asia, was now, finally, on the move. That tinder, that dry waiting fuel for the fire, hadn't been gathered in a single year. It was the work of a generation. The world the plague found was not a happy, robust, merry old England, world of feasting and Renaissance fairs. It was a world living on a knife edge, a world that had, within the living memory of every adult, already endured an apocalypse. We call it the Great Famine of 1315. It was a crisis that fundamentally broke the confidence of the 14th century, leaving it brittle and fearful long before the first plague ship ever docked. It began, as so many catastrophes do, with the weather. The medieval warm period, a lovely stretch of centuries, where vineyards flourished in England and Vikings farmed in Greenland, was definitively over. The climate was shifting, becoming colder, more erratic, and most fatally, much, much wetter. In the spring of 1315, it began to rain, and it did not stop. Not for the rest of that year. Not for the spring of 1316. Not for the summer after that. It was a deluge of biblical proportions, a seemingly endless, cold, grey sheet of water that fell upon a Europe whose entire civilization was built on the dry land grains of wheat, barley, and rye. The fields became liquid mud. The seed grain, scattered with hope, simply rotted in the earth or was washed away. The harvest of 1315 was a catastrophic failure. The harvest of 1316 was, impossibly, worse. What little grain was brought in was sodden, blighted with fungus, and barely edible. The effect was not gradual. It was immediate and terrifying. The price of food didn't just rise, it exploded. In England, wheat prices shot up by 800%. A loaf of bread that cost a penny one day Holocaust ate the next. For the vast majority of the population, peasants who lived on a subsistence level, whose entire wealth was the grain in their small barn, this was a death sentence. They ate their seed corn first, a desperate gamble that meant they were sacrificing any hope for the next year's harvest. Then they ate their livestock, the oxen they needed to plow the fields. Then they ate the bark from the trees, the roots in the forest, the cats and dogs in the village. And then, well, the historical records, grim and unflinching, are filled with whispers of the final taboo, rumors of cannibalism, of strangers being waylaid on the roads, of children disappearing. While some of these tales might be medieval hyperbole, the chroniclers of the time believed them. The sheer desperation is hard to comprehend. This was not a short-term supply chain crisis, to use our modern sterile term. This was the complete collapse of the food system for 2 to 3 straight years. Millions died, not from a dramatic illness, but from the slow, hollow, agonizing emptiness of starvation, or from the diseases that prey on the weakened: typhus, dysentery, pneumonia. The institutions that were supposed to protect them were utterly helpless. Kings, like Edward II of England, found their own households unable to procure bread. They issued edicts trying to cap the price of grain, a move that only made things worse, as farmers simply hid what little they had, rather than sell it at a loss. The church, the great spiritual pillar of medieval life, could offer nothing but prayers, and the prayers, it seemed, were not being answered. The rain continued to fall. When the famine finally broke around 1317, and the weather patterns allowed for a decent harvest by 1322, the world that emerged was not the same. It was emptier, sadder, and profoundly traumatized. The demographic loss was staggering, with some regions seeing a 10% to 15% drop in population. But the psychological scar was even deeper. The old certainties were gone. The compact between the people, the nobles, and God had been broken. The lords, their own incomes decimated, responded not with charity, but by squeezing their surviving tenants even harder, raising taxes and rents to try and recoup their losses. This created a simmering resentment, a deep-seated anger between the classes that would have profound consequences when the plague arrived. But this period also presents us with a fascinating and grim historiographical debate. The mainstream fact is that the famine left Europe weakened, and thus more susceptible to the plague that would arrive 25 years later. It seems simple. A malnourished population is an immunocompromised population. But is it true? The gap in time, a full quarter century, is the problem. A 25-year-old in 1347 would have been born after the famine, but their parents would have been its survivors. Were these children born to starved parents, stunted or constitutionally weaker? Or does the opposite logic apply? This is the darker Malthusian hypothesis. Perhaps the Great Famine, by culling the weakest 15% of the population, had inadvertently strengthened Europe's gene pool. This theory suggests the survivors were the toughest, the hardiest, the most resilient, and that the population that met the plague in 1347 was, in fact, smaller, but more robust than it had been a century earlier. This mystery, was the post-famine generation weaker or stronger, changes how we view the plague. If they were weaker, the Black Death becomes a tragic finishing blow to a society already on its knees. If they were stronger, it makes the plague's 50% mortality rate even more terrifying. It would mean Yersinia pestis was so virulent, so overwhelmingly lethal, that it scythed through even a hardened population with ease. The truth, as is often the case, probably lies in a complex middle. The famine wasn't just a biological event, it was a social one. It drove people from their rural farms into the newly crowded, dirty, and desperate cities, looking for work or charity. It broke traditional social bonds. It left the financial systems of Europe, like the great Florentine banks, overextended and on the verge of collapse. It left the entire system, from the peasant's stomach to the king's treasury, stressed, fragile, and with no margin for error. This was the world that was about to be tested. It was a world that had already seen the bottom fall out. And its greatest fear was that something, anything, could be worse. The terror of 1347 was built on a terrible, profound sense of originality. The people of the 14th century, from the physicians in Paris to the peasants in Tuscany, genuinely believed they were facing something new, a judgment or a sickness without precedent in the memory of humankind. They were wrong. The world had seen this exact monster before. It had simply been so long ago, so utterly devastating, that its memory had passed from medicine and into myth. The great pestilence of 1347 was not the first pandemic of this plague. It was the second. To find the first, we have to wind the clock all the way back, past the Crusades, past Charlemagne, past the fall of Rome, to the year 541 AD. We have to look at the world of the Eastern Roman Empire, the glittering, sophisticated civilization we now call Byzantium. In 541, the man on the throne in Constantinople was Justinian Thus. He was, perhaps, the last truly Roman emperor, a man of boundless energy, ambition, and iron will. He was building the Hagia Sophia, a dome so vast it seemed to hang from heaven by a golden chain. He was rewriting the entire legal system of the Western world, creating the corpus juris civilis, the foundation of many legal systems to this day. And most importantly, he was waging a desperate, glorious war to reconquer the lost Western territories, Italy, North Africa, Spain, and put the Roman Empire back together. His great general, Belisarius, was on the cusp of success. It seemed, for a brief shining moment, that the grandeur of Rome was about to be restored. And then, the ghost arrived. It came from the same direction, the east. Specifically, it came from the port of Pelusium in Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire. Historians of the time, like the brilliant Procopius of Caesarea, recorded its arrival. He, like his 14th century counterparts, was at a loss to explain it. He noted it seemed to travel by no known means, appearing in coastal cities first, then moving inland. And the symptoms he described, with a chilling lack of medical jargon, are all too familiar. A sudden fever, delirium, and then the swellings, the buboes. Procopius wrote of them appearing in the groin, in the armpits, behind the ears. He wrote of some people falling into a deep coma and others into a state of violent, sleepless paranoia. He also noted, with terror, that if the swellings turned black and burst, the patient might, against all odds, survive. But if they remained, the end was swift. This was the plague of Justinian. And for nearly 1,500 years, historians faced a compelling mystery. Was this the plague? Was this Yersinia pestis? Or was it something else? A different hemorrhagic fever, smallpox, or some other pathogen we no longer recognize? Procopius's description was vivid, but it was just a description. The debate was fierce. Some scholars argued that the symptoms were too varied, or that the described spread was inconsistent. It was an 800-year-old cold case. The mystery was only solved, definitively, in our own 21st century. Archaeologists excavating 6th century graves in Germany found skeletal remains, and from the pulp of their teeth, paleogeneticists were able to extract tiny fragmented strands of ancient DNA. They found the genetic fingerprints of Yersinia pestis. It was the same culprit. The monster had an 800-year gap in its resume, but it was the same killer. The impact of this first pandemic was, if anything, even worse than the second. The Black Death of 1347 struck a decentralized, feudal, and relatively low-tech Europe. The plague of Justinian struck the most sophisticated, urbanized, and interconnected civilization on Earth. Constantinople was the largest city in the world, a dense metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people. When the plague hit, Procopius wrote that at its peak, 10,000 people were dying per day. The city's administrative functions completely collapsed. There was no one to bake bread, no one to guard the walls, and most critically, no one to bury the dead. Justinian ordered the city's burial grounds to be emptied and new ones dug, but they filled instantly. In desperation, they filled the stone towers of the city walls with corpses, layering them like lasagna, pressing them down, and putting a thin layer of plaster on top, only to have the putrefaction swell and break the roof. The emperor himself caught the plague. He developed the buboes, the fever, and against all expectations, he survived. But the empire he ruled would never recover. The plague scoured the Mediterranean world for 2 centuries. It didn't just strike once. Like the Black Death that would follow, it returned in waves every decade or so, finding the new generation of children who had no immunity. It shattered Justinian's dreams of reconquest. His armies, starved of gold, and more importantly, of new recruits, withered away. The population of the empire may have fallen by as much as 50% in the first wave alone, and perhaps 60% or 70% by the time it finally burned out in the mid-8th century. It created a vacuum, an empty world that allowed new groups, the Lombards in Italy, the Slavs in the Balkans, and most significantly, the armies of Islam expanding out of Arabia to reshape the map of the world. It was, quite possibly, the event that truly ended the classical Roman world and ushered in the Dark Ages. This, then, leads to the greatest historical mystery of all. If this event was so catastrophic, so world-ending, why, in 1347, did no one remember it? The physicians in Paris, the doctors in Florence, the monks in England, their libraries were full of classical texts. They read Roman and Greek authors. And yet, there is not a single medical text from the 14th century that says, wait, I've read about this. Procopius described this exact thing. The knowledge was lost. How? It's a chilling testament to the fragility of memory. 800 years was simply too long. The plague of Justinian was so far in the past that it had become a story, a biblical-sounding smiting written by an ancient historian. It wasn't seen as a practical medical precedent. It was like us reading a story about a dragon. We don't use it to write public health policy. The 14th century world was, in this one crucial aspect, completely amnesiac. They were standing on the beach, watching a tidal wave approach, with no cultural memory of the last great tsunami. This failure of institutional memory, the gap of 800 years, is what made the Black Death so truly terrifying. It felt like the end of the world, because as far as anyone knew, it was the first time. They had no playbook, no ancestral wisdom. No, this is what our forefathers did. They were alone, facing a monster they thought was brand new, but which was, in reality, just an ancient ghost, come back to haunt the world once more. The ghost that haunted Justinian's empire, the monster that the 14th century believed was a new and nameless judgment, finally has a name for us. It is Yersinia pestis. It is a simple, rod-shaped bacterium, a single-celled organism so small that millions could fit on the head of a pin. It is not intelligent. It is not evil. It has no grand design to wipe out humanity. It is, like all life, simply a machine for its own survival. And in the 14th century, its survival strategy accidentally intersected with our own, with a catastrophic efficiency that beggars belief. This single, tiny organism is the culprit, the microscopic engine behind the entire Black Death. And the reason it was so uniquely devastating is that it attacked the human body in 3 distinct, terrifying, and lethally cooperative ways. The first and most classic form is the one that gives the plague its common name, bubonic plague. This is the disease as it exists in its natural reservoir in rodent populations carried by their fleas. The bacterium has a grimly brilliant life cycle. It enters a flea, let's say the common rat flea Xenopsilla chiopis, when it bites an infected rodent. Once inside the flea's gut, Yersinia pestis begins to multiply at an astonishing rate, mixing with the digested blood until it forms a thick, gelatinous plug. This plug, known as a biofilm, completely blocks the flea's digestive tract. The flea is now, in effect, starving to death. Driven by a desperate, maddening hunger, it jumps to a new host, another rat, or when the rats die off, a nearby human, and it tries to feed. It bites, it sucks. But the plug in its gut prevents the blood from going down. In a fit of frustrated hunger, the flea essentially vomits, spewing the bacteria-laden plug from its own stomach directly back into the bite wound of its new host. Once inside the human, the bacteria are like an invading army. They travel through the lymphatic system, the body's internal highway, looking for the nearest command center to conquer. This is the lymph node. It might be in the groin if the bite was on the leg, in the armpit if it was on the arm, or in the neck. Here, the bacteria settle in and begin to multiply. The lymph node, sensing the invasion, floods the area with white blood cells, beginning a desperate losing war. The node swells, becoming hot, hard, and agonizingly painful. This swelling is the infamous bubo. As the bacteria win the fight, the tissue inside the node dies, a process called necrosis. The bubo, which can swell to the size of an apple, turns black and fills with a putrid, liquefied mass of dead tissue and bacteria. This is the body's fortress, breached and turned into a factory for the enemy. If untreated, this form of the plague has a mortality rate of somewhere between 50 and 70%. It's a coin flip, but a terrifying one. But Yersinia pestis is a versatile killer. Sometimes, the bacteria aren't contained by the lymph node. They break out and continue their journey, and their next target is the lungs. This is the second form, pneumonic plague. This is the version that truly explains the terrifying speed of the Black Death's spread. Once the bacteria establish a colony in the lungs, the patient develops a severe, bloody pneumonia. They begin to cough, and with every cough, they aerosolize the bacteria, spraying a fine, invisible mist of death into the air. This form no longer needs a flea. It no longer needs a rat. It is now simply a person-to-person disease. Anyone who breathes in those droplets can be infected, and the bacteria go straight into their lungs. This form has a mortality rate of 95 to 100%. In the 14th century, huddled together in cold, poorly ventilated huts during winter, this form was a wildfire. It explains why the plague didn't stop for the winter, as a purely flea-borne disease should have. It just changed its tactics. The third form is the most terrifying of all, the one that left medieval chroniclers speechless. This is septicemic plague. Sometimes the bacteria bypass the lymph nodes entirely, or they break out of a bubo and simply flood the entire bloodstream. This is a full system, catastrophic failure. The bacteria multiply so fast in the blood that they trigger a massive, body-wide inflammatory response known as sepsis. The immune system, in a panic, basically self-destructs. The blood vessels begin to hemorrhage. Small clots form everywhere, blocking circulation to the extremities, while in other places, the blood loses its ability to clot at all. This is what causes the black in Black Death. Blood, leaking from the vessels, pools under the skin, creating dark bruises and splotches called acral necrosis. The fingers, the toes, the nose, the lips, they turn black and die, even while the person is still alive. This form is 100% fatal. There is no recovery. Death often comes in less than 24 hours, sometimes so fast that the buboes, the signature symptom, don't even have time to form. This is the source of the medieval accounts of terror. The man who was hale and well at breakfast, but supped with his ancestors in paradise by evening. This brings us to one of the most heated historiographic debates of the 20th century. For decades, some historians, most notably Samuel Cohn, looked at the medieval descriptions and said, "This doesn't add up. The behavior of the Black Death seemed wrong." Modern bubonic plague, seen in the 20th century, just doesn't move that fast. It's relatively hard to catch, and it's heavily dependent on rats. The 14th century accounts, by contrast, scream contagion. They describe a disease that rips through populations like a modern flu, one that seems to pass directly from person to person. Cohn and others hypothesized that the Black Death must have been something else entirely. Perhaps a hemorrhagic fever, like Ebola, or a now extinct virus. For a time, this was a plausible, if radical, hypothesis. The mystery was, as we mentioned, solved by DNA. The plague pits of the 14th century gave up their dead, and the DNA of Yersinia pestis was found in them, time and time again, from London to Marseille. The culprit is confirmed, but Cohn's questions remain. Why did it behave so differently? This is the new, more subtle mystery, and the answer is likely a combination of factors. The strain of Yersinia pestis from the 14th century was genetically different from most modern strains, perhaps more virulent. The pneumonic form was likely far more common than we initially thought, and a hypothesis we will explore later. The vector might not have been just the rat flea. What if the human flea, or even the common body louse, was also capable of transmitting the disease? In a 14th century world where everyone had lice, that would create a terrifying bridge, a person-to-person spread that didn't need a cough, just proximity. The killer, we know, but the full horrifying specifics of its 14th century methods are still a chilling puzzle we are slowly piecing together. This killer, Yersinia pestis, was not new. It was ancient. It did not spring into existence in 1345, formed from the conjunction of planets or the miasma of a swamp. It had a homeland, a permanent address, a place where it existed in a quiet, stable, and eternal balance with its natural hosts. This place was not a city, not a battlefield, but an almost impossibly vast sea of grass, sand, and mountains, the Eurasian steppe. This immense ribbon of territory, stretching from Manchuria in the east to the edges of Hungary in the west, was, and still is, the plague's natural reservoir. Here, it is not a pandemic. It is simply a fact of life, an endemic presence in the local wildlife, particularly in the vast, burrowing communities of rodents. And its preferred host, the animal that forms the deep foundational well of the disease, is not the rat. It is the marmot. These large squirrel-like creatures live in extensive underground cities, complex warrens, where Yersinia pestis and its attendant fleas can cycle indefinitely. In this environment, the plague is relatively stable. It might cause a localized die-off in one marmot colony, but other colonies survive. The bacterium lives on, taking over, a slow-burning fire that never truly goes out. For centuries, this cycle was contained, a local secret of the steppe, a danger known only to the nomadic peoples who lived there. They knew, through hard-won ancestral knowledge, that one should never hunt a sick or slow marmot. That was a sign of the tarbagan, the local name for the pestilence, and to handle such an animal was death. This delicate, dangerous balance was maintained for 1,000 years. So what changed? Why, in the early 14th century, did this localized, quiet bacterium suddenly explode, break its chains, and conquer the world? This is the search for the Big Bang of the Black Death, a question that has haunted historians for centuries and has only recently been answered through the astonishing science of paleogenetics. For a long time, historians looked at the map and made an educated guess. The plague seemed to come from the east. China was often blamed, India, but these were vague. The real clue lay in a very specific place, a small, ancient, Nestorian Christian graveyard near Lake Issyk-Kul in what is today Kyrgyzstan. In this cemetery, archaeologists in the 1880s found a small cluster of tombstones with unusually precise dates, 1338 and 1339, and unlike the other tombstones, these were inscribed with a cause of death. They died, the Syriac inscriptions read, of pestilence. This was a tantalizing clue. The dates were perfect, just a few years before the plague erupted in the Black Sea. But was this the pestilence, or just some local fever? For over 100 years, it was a historical curiosity, a footnote. The mystery was finally solved when researchers, led by Dr. Johannes Krause, managed to go back to those graves. They exhumed the bodies of those individuals from 1338, and from the pulp of their teeth, they hunted for genetic fragments. They found it, the DNA of Yersinia pestis. But they found something even more astonishing. By sequencing this 1338 strain, they discovered that it was the direct ancestor, the patient 0 strain, of all the Black Death plagues that would soon appear in Europe. It was the trunk of the tree from which the London strain, the Marseille strain, and all the others would branch. The graveyard at Lake Issyk-Kul was not just a plague site, it was ground zero. This then is the mainstream, now proven fact. The Black Death began its global journey in this specific region of Central Asia in the late 1330s. But this fact immediately opens the next, deeper mystery. How? How did the bacterium make the leap from a self-contained marmot colony in the relatively isolated mountains of Kyrgyzstan into the human population, and then onto the world's busiest highway, the Silk Road? This is where we move from genetic certainty to historical hypothesis. The answer is likely a perfect storm of human action and environmental change. The 14th century was a period of high fashion, and the fur trade was booming. Marmot fur, a cheap and passable imitation of more expensive pelts, was a major commodity. It's easy to imagine a hunter finding a slow marmot, one sick with the plague, and seeing it as an easy kill. In skinning this animal, he infects himself, perhaps getting the bacteria into a small cut on his hand. He then stumbles back to his village or to a local trading post, bringing the septicemic or pneumonic form with him. This human action may have been propelled by a climatic one. The same little ice age that was bringing the Great Famine to Europe was also disrupting the climate of the steppe. This could have caused a rodent crash, a sudden collapse in the marmot population from cold or starvation, forcing their suddenly hostless, hungry fleas to seek new targets. Those targets would have been the camels, the horses, and the humans of the next caravan passing through. The plague had found its exit. The Silk Road was the vector. It was not a single road. It was a vast, sprawling network of trade routes, a kind of 14th century internet made of camel trains and dusty tracks. It was the artery that connected the East and West, carrying silk, spices, porcelain, and ideas. And now it was carrying a microscopic stowaway. This is the great irony. The 14th century was, in many ways, the first age of true globalization. The Mongol Empire, by conquering nearly all of Asia, had pacified this vast region, making trade safer and more lucrative than ever before. This Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, was the very thing that allowed the plague to travel. The bacterium didn't have to cross hostile borders. It traveled within a single, massive, interconnected empire. The disease was now on the move, traveling in the fur bales, in the grain sacks, or most likely, in the bodies of the fleas living on the merchants themselves and their domestic black rats that had tagged along for the ride. It would have moved at the speed of a camel, about 15-20 miles a day, stopping at each crowded shared caravanserai, the wayside inns where merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims from a dozen different lands slept huddled together for warmth and safety. Each stop was an opportunity for the disease to spill over, to find a new host, to branch off. The Big Bang at Lake Issyk-Kul was the initial explosion, and the Silk Road was the shower of shrapnel, carrying the deadly fragments west, towards the Caspian Sea, towards the great trading hubs of the Black Sea, towards a Europe that was waiting, fat, prosperous, and utterly oblivious. The plague had broken out of its ancient reservoir. It had survived the high, cold mountain passes and the arid deserts of the Silk Road. It was now established in the great trading cities of the Caspian and Black Seas. But to make the next great leap, to cross the water and begin its conquest of Europe, it needed a partner, a vehicle. And for over a century, our understanding of this partnership has been dominated by one single, iconic culprit, the black rat, Rattus rattus, and its loyal companion, the oriental rat flea, Xenopsilla chiopes. This is the classic, mainstream story, the one taught in every textbook. It's a simple, compelling narrative. The plague in this version is a zoonotic disease, a sickness of rats that spills over into humans by accident. The black rat a nimble climber and a stowaway, loved human habitations. It lived in the thatch of roofs, in the walls of wattle and daub houses, and most importantly, it loved the dark, cavernous holds of cargo ships. In this scenario, the plague's journey is a story of rat-to-rat transmission. The fleas live on the rats, drinking their blood. When an infected rat dies, its body cools, and its hungry fleas, those blocked, starving vectors we discussed, seek the nearest warm-blooded meal. In a crowded city or a packed ship's hold, that new meal would be another healthy rat. The plague would thus spread through the rodent underworld of a city first, an invisible subterranean fire. Only when this epizootic, an epidemic among animals, became so devastating that the rats died in massive numbers, would the fleas, in their desperation, make the jump to the next best thing, the humans living alongside them. This explains the slight lag chroniclers sometimes noted. A few days of uncanny silence or reports of dead rats in the streets, followed by the sudden explosion of human cases. The rat, in this model, is the plague's Trojan horse, carrying the flea army unseen into every fortress and farmhouse in Europe. This theory is neat, it's logical, and it's almost certainly part of the truth. But for decades, historians and scientists have pointed to nagging, persistent problems with it. The model feels incomplete. The Black Death, as described by eyewitnesses, moved with a speed that is simply breathtaking. It traveled through medieval Europe with its slow, horse-drawn carts and foot traffic at an average speed of several miles a day. In the winter, a disease entirely dependent on the Ratus ratus and its specific flea, Xenocilla chiopes, should not have been able to do this. That particular flea is a creature of warm, humid climates. It becomes dormant, and its eggs fail to hatch in the cold. The plague, however, ripped through Scandinavia in the dead of winter. It devastated mountain villages high in the Alps, places too cold and with too little green to support a large, thriving black rat population. Furthermore, the accounts themselves are strangely silent. Medieval chroniclers were meticulous observers of their world. They wrote about the weather, the crops, the comets. Yet, in all the thousands of pages of plague testimony, there is a baffling lack of one key detail: a massive continent-wide die-off of rats. They talk about the buboes, the coughing, the death. They do not talk about the streets being carpeted with dead rodents. This is the great historiographical mystery at the heart of the vector debate. If the plague was a rat disease, where were all the dead rats? This is where the compelling and frankly terrifying counter-hypothesis comes in. What if the black rat was only a supporting player? What if the true vector, the engine of the plague's horrifying speed, was us? This theory posits that the primary vector was not the rat flea, but the human ectoparasite. Specifically, the human body louse, Pediculus humanis humanus, and perhaps even the human flea, Pulex irritans. This is the human vector hypothesis, and it changes everything. Unlike the rat flea, which prefers rats, human lice and fleas live on humans. They feed on humans. They travel on humans. They live in the seams of the wool and linen clothing that people wore day in and day out, often without washing, for weeks or months at a time. In the 14th century, everyone had lice. It was not a sign of poverty or filth. It was a simple, unavoidable fact of life, like mud or taxes. If a body louse could transmit Yersinia pestis, and modern laboratory studies have proven that it can, then the plague was no longer a rat disease that spilled over. It was a human disease, passed directly from person to person at the speed of human travel. The louse would bite an infected person, ingest the septicemic blood, and then, perhaps a few days later, move to a new host. When the louse defecates, which it does while feeding, the bacteria-laden feces are smeared into the new bite wound by the host's own scratching. This mechanism is fast, direct, and horrifyingly efficient. This model solves all the problems of the rat theory. It explains how the plague spread in winter. The lice, nestled in wool clothing, kept warm by a human body, wouldn't have even noticed the cold. It explains how it devastated rat-poor mountain villages. It didn't need rats. It just needed people. It explains the terrifying speed. A merchant on a horse, feeling ill, could carry his infected lice 50 miles in 2 days. He stops at an inn, sharing a bed for warmth with another traveler. A common practice. The lice migrate. The plague is past. The merchant dies in the inn, while the new traveler carries the disease to the next town, 50 miles further on. The plague in this model becomes a relay race, with human hosts passing the baton of infected lice and fleas. It also explains the pneumonic form. A louse-borne bubonic plague and an airborne pneumonic plague are not two separate diseases. They are partners. The louse-borne version creates the initial septicemic infections, which then become pneumonic, allowing the disease to explode through a household in its aerosolized form. The truth is probably a grim combination of all these things. The plague was not one single trick. It was an arsenal. It likely arrived in Europe on the rats and their fleas, establishing a beachhead. From there, it spread in every way it could. It moved rat to rat. It jumped rat to human. It passed human to human via lice and fleas, and it exploded human to human via the lungs. It was this multi-pronged, adaptable, and relentless strategy that made it so unconquerable. It didn't just have a plan B, it had a plan C and D. And as it established itself in the port cities of the Black Sea, it was about to find its most effective mode of transport yet, a vehicle that would carry it past all walls and all guards, a Genoese merchant galley. The death ship was loading its cargo. The plague had found its vectors. It had a rat army, a louse army, and the invisible airborne cavalry of the pneumonic form. It had traveled the Silk Road and had now thoroughly infiltrated the great cosmopolitan trading hubs of the Black Sea. But it was still just barely contained on the Asian continent. To make the final fateful jump into Europe, it needed a flashpoint, a single event so violent and chaotic that it would shatter the quarantine of the sea. It found that flashpoint in the year 1346 at a walled city on the coast of the Crimean Peninsula. The city was Kaffa, a fabulously wealthy trading post, a small slice of Italy perched on the very edge of the Mongol world. Kaffa, known today as Feodosia, was run by the Genoese. These were not conquerors. They were merchants, the great rivals of Venice, and they had built an empire of commerce. Kaffa was their flagship port in the east. It was the end of the Silk Road, the precise point where the spices, silks, and furs that had traveled for months by camel were loaded onto the high, round-bellied cog ships that would sail them back to the markets of Italy. The city was a bustling, multilingual, multicultural hub, protected by high stone walls and a deep moat. It was a fortress of capitalism, existing uneasily on the shores of the vast territory controlled by the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that ruled over Russia and the steppe. For a time, The relationship between the Genoese merchants and the Mongol Khans was mutually beneficial. The Genoese got rich, and the Khan, Jani Beg, got rich by taxing them. But in 1343, the relationship soured. A street brawl in the nearby port of Tana over a Venetian merchant, the Genoese's rivals, escalated. A Mongol was killed, and the Italians fled back to Kaffa. Jani Beg, enraged by this act of defiance, and perhaps looking for a pretext to seize the city's immense wealth, demanded the Genoese be handed over. They refused, and so Jani Beg did what the Golden Horde did best. He laid siege. For 2 years, the siege dragged on. The Mongol army, vast and skilled, could not breach the mighty Italian-built walls. The Genoese, safe inside, simply waited, resupplied by sea, confident they could outlast the barbarians. Then in 1346, something changed. A new terrifying ally joined the Mongol camp. It was the pestilence, having completed its journey from the steppe. It ripped through the besieging army with a ferocity that stunned them. The chroniclers describe a force that was killing thousands every day, a sickness that left the soldiers weak, demoralized, and dying in heaps. Jani Beg's army, the most feared military machine in the world, was disintegrating from the inside out. The Genoese, watching from the battlements, must have felt a sense of grim, divine justice. Their enemy was being smitten by God. The siege was about to be broken, and here, in this moment of desperation, is where our story takes its most sinister and debated turn. This is the mainstream fact. The plague, which was destroying the Mongol army outside the walls, somehow got inside the walls and infected the city of Kaffa. The Genoese, now terrified, abandoned their post, fled to their ships, and sailed for home, carrying the disease with them. But how did it get inside? This brings us to the famous contested hypothesis, the first act of biological warfare in history. The story comes to us from a single dramatic source, an Italian notary named Gabriele de Mussi. Writing from his home in Piacenza a couple of years later, he described what he heard had happened. Jani Beg, seeing his army destroyed and enraged at the smug, safe Christians within the walls, decided on a final satanic act of revenge. He ordered his soldiers to collect the boo-boo-blackened, suppurating corpses of their own dead comrades. He loaded them onto his trebuchets, his giant siege catapults, and then he launched them. One after another, the infected bodies were hurled high into the air, tumbling end over end, soaring over the high stone walls, and landing with a sickening liquid impact in the crowded streets of Kaffa. De Mussi's account is pure horror. He describes the Genoese as being stunned, horrified, unable to hide from the grotesque bombardment. They tried to collect the mountains of the dead and throw them into the sea, but the stench was overwhelming, the air itself poisoned. Soon, the arrows of death were flying, and the pestilence erupted within the city. It is an almost unbelievably cinematic moment. But did it happen? This is the great mystery of Kaffa. For centuries, this story was accepted as fact. It was the story of how the plague entered Europe. But modern historians are deeply divided. The problem is de Mussi himself. He wasn't in Kaffa. He was in Italy. He was, in all likelihood, reporting a fantastic, terrifying rumor that had traveled back along the same trade routes as the plague. It's exactly the kind of story that would be told and retold, growing more dramatic with each telling. Some historians argue the physics are wrong. A rotting corpse is a fragile, soft thing. Would it hold together when launched from a catapult, or would it disintegrate into a red mist mid-flight? Others argue that this dramatic, evil act, while cinematically perfect, was completely unnecessary. The plague didn't need a catapult. Kaffa was a besieged city, but it was not hermetically sealed. It was swarming with the other vector, the black rat. The same rats that were feasting on the grain in the Genoese warehouses were also feasting in the Mongol camp, and they would have passed back and forth under the walls, through drains and culverts, with total indifference to the human conflict above. The rats would have died, and their fleas would have found new homes on the Genoese rats, which in turn lived in the houses and on the ships of the merchants. The plague was going to get into Kaffa. It was inevitable. It's entirely possible that a terrified Genoese lookout, seeing a puff of smoke from a catapult followed a week later by the outbreak of the plague, simply put two and two together and created a legend. But then again, does the story's dramatic flair mean it isn't true? A siege was a place of psychological terror. Johnny Beg, watching his army die, may well have been desperate enough and cruel enough to try anything, even if the biological effect was minimal. The psychological effect of having rotting bodies rain down on your city would be devastating. In the end, it almost doesn't matter. Whether by rat, flea, or corpse, the arrows of death found their mark. Kaffa, the impregnable fortress, was now a plague pit. The Genoese resistance broke. The survivors, a mix of the sick, the dying, and the terrified, but not yet symptomatic, ran for the only escape route they had, the sea. They piled into their galleys, raised the sails, and fled west, back towards home, back towards Italy. They didn't know it, but they had become the very death ships that would deliver the apocalypse to Europe. The flight from Kaffa was not an organized retreat. It was a panicked, desperate scramble. In the autumn of 1347, the Genoese survivors, a frantic mix of the outwardly healthy, the secretly incubating, and the visibly dying, piled onto their galleys. These ships were not empty vessels. They were cargo ships. They were loaded with the very goods they had spent years acquiring: silks, spices, and critically, boils of fur and sacks of grain. And in this cargo, nestled deep, was the plague's secret army, the black rats, Ratus ratus, and their flea-ridden nests. The ships, carrying a triple threat of infected humans, infected rats, and infected fleas, pushed off from the Crimean coast and set a desperate course for home. The journey from the Black Sea to Italy was a well-worn path, but it was a long one. It meant sailing through the Bosphorus, past the great city of Constantinople, which they also infected, sparking the plague's arrival there, out into the Aegean, and then across the Mediterranean towards Sicily. This journey would take weeks, and on a medieval ship, weeks was an eternity of shared misery. These galleys were not spacious. They were crowded, with sailors, merchants, and soldiers living and sleeping in cramped, shared quarters. The holes where the rats lived were just below them. It was the perfect incubator. A man who boarded the ship in Kaffa, feeling perfectly healthy, merely carrying the bacteria in his system, would have, by day 5, developed the fever. By day 7, the buboes. By day 10, he might be delirious, coughing, and spreading the pneumonic form to his shipmates in the close, damp air below decks. One by one, the crew would have sickened. The rowers, chained to their benches, would have slumped over their oars. The merchants, in their small cabins, would have been overcome by the fever. The captain, trying to navigate, would have collapsed at the tiller. We must imagine the sheer claustrophobic horror of that voyage. A wooden box, floating on an endless sea, from which there was no escape. The healthy were trapped with the dying were trapped with the dead. As sailors perished, their bodies were likely thrown overboard, a constant, grim procession. By the time these ships neared their destination, they were barely functioning. They were ghost ships, manned by a skeleton crew of the last survivors, or perhaps even just drifting, their sails set, with almost everyone aboard, either dead or dying. In October of 1347, this small fleet of 12 Genoese galleys appeared on the horizon off the coast of Sicily. They were heading for the port of Messina, a bustling, prosperous harbor and a key stopping point on the way to Genoa. The people of Messina, watching from the shore, would have seen a familiar sight: their own merchant ships returning from the east. But as the ships drew closer, the scene must have turned to one of confusion, and then to terror. There was no triumphant ringing of bells, no sailors cheering from the rigging. The ships were eerily silent. They drifted into the harbor, sluggish and unresponsive, when the harbor master and the first brave townspeople rowed out to greet them. They were met with a vision from hell. The decks, according to the chronicler Michael of Piazza, were slick with a lingering sickness in the blood. The rowers' benches were filled with the dead, still chained to their oars. The few survivors they found were walking ghosts, grievously afflicted, covered in the black swellings, delirious with fever and coughing up blood. Piazza wrote that they were so stricken that anyone who only spoke to them was seized by the mortal illness. The Messinians, in a panic, realized these men had brought the arrows of death with them. Here is the mainstream fact. In October 1347, the Black Death arrived in Europe at the port of Messina, Sicily, carried by Genoese galleys fleeing Caffa. The local authorities, in a fit of terror, took immediate action. They passed a decree. The ships were to be expelled. No one was to trade with them. No one was to speak to them. The death ships were forced back out to sea, their anchors cut, to drift aimlessly and carry their pestilence elsewhere. But it was, of course, far, far too late. The damage was done. The 2 weeks the ships had likely spent in harbor, negotiating, begging for help, or perhaps even hiding the extent of the sickness, was all it took. The rats, sensing a sinking or food-rich vessel, would have been the first ones off, scurrying down the mooring ropes and vanishing into the alleys and warehouses of Messina's waterfront. The fleas on the sick sailors, on the cargo, on the rats, had found a new continent to explore, and perhaps a sick sailor, desperate for one night on solid ground, had slipped past the guards and spent his last coins in a tavern. Within days of the ship's expulsion, the first residents of Messina began to fall ill. The same fevers, the same black buboes. The town erupted in panic. They fled, streaming out of the city gates, carrying the disease with them into the Sicilian countryside, to the nearby city of Catania, and across the island. Messina, the gateway to Europe, had fallen. This leads to the great mystery of the arrival. Why were they ever allowed to dock? It's a question that seems to our modern, quarantine-conscious minds completely baffling. The ships were visibly full of dead and dying men. Why would any port authority Let them tie up. The answer is a window into the 14th century mind. They didn't have a germ theory. They had the miasma theory. They believed the sickness was in the air, perhaps a poison, trapped in the ship's hold. They may have believed that once the sailors were on land, in the fresh air of Sicily, they might recover. But more likely, the answer is simpler and more tragic. They didn't know. The first ships that arrived might not have been in such an apocalyptic state. Perhaps only a few sailors were sick, a ship's fever that was common. They were allowed to dock, to unload their cargo that was, after all, worth a fortune. And in that cargo were the rats, the mass death, the panic, the expulsion order. All of this may have happened after the plague was already loose in the city. The other larger hypothesis is that Messina wasn't even the only entry point. It's just the first one we have a dramatic written record for. Those 12 galleys from Kaffa were not traveling alone. They were part of a vast network. Other ships, Venetian and Genoese, were also fleeing the Black Sea. It's highly probable that at the exact same time, in the autumn of 1347, other death ships were sailing to other ports. One fleet went to Genoa, the home port. Another went to Venice. Another to Pisa. The plague didn't knock on Europe's front door. It broke in through every window, door, and crack in the foundation all at once. The arrival in Messina is simply the patient zero story we remember. The opening scene of a horror movie that was, in reality, already premiering in a dozen different theaters at the exact same time. The expulsion of the death ships from Messina was a futile, terrified gesture. It was like trying to put out a forest fire by stamping on a single ember, long after the wind had carried the sparks for miles. The plague was loose. It did not need the Genoese galleys anymore. It had found a new, richer, and far more connected home. Sicily was an island, a tragic, isolated laboratory. But the plague's ambitions were continental, and its next target was the mainland of Italy, the very heart of European civilization. And in Italy, two cities stood above all others as beacons of wealth, culture, and commerce, Venice and Florence. Their greatness was about to become their undoing. They were not just cities. They were the central processing units of the medieval world, and they were about to be terminally infected. The plague arrived in Venice in the cold first months of 1348, likely carried by a ship from Ragusa, Dubrovnik, which had been infected by a ship from somewhere else. The lines of contagion were already becoming a tangled web. But Venice was different from Messina. It was not just a port. It was, arguably, the most important port in the world. It was the gateway to the east, the great terminus of the silk and spice roads. Its entire existence was built on ships, on trade, on a constant swirling flow of goods and people. It was also, physically, a perfect trap. A city of 150,000 people, one of Europe's largest, packed onto a cluster of low-lying islands, a maze of narrow damp alleys and crowded multi-story tenements. It was a city with no fresh running water beyond the rain collected in cisterns. A city whose sewers were the same canals that served as its streets. The Venetians, to their credit, saw the danger and reacted with a speed and ruthless organization that no one else had. Venice was a republic, run by a committee of sober, practical merchants. They did not wait for God or blame the planets. They acted. They formed a crisis committee of 3 wise men to manage the pestilence. They established the world's first lazaretto, a quarantine island, though this system would be perfected in later outbreaks. They banned ships from infected ports. They ordered the city to be cleansed of sweetness, which they believed, in their miasma theory, held the plague, by cleaning out the animal waste and filth. Most famously, they deployed plague doctors. But we must be careful with our imagery. The famous terrifying beak mask, with its glass eyes and leather coat, was a 17th century invention from a later plague. The 14th century doctor was far more helpless, clad in normal robes, holding a pomander of sweet-smelling herbs to his nose, a fragile, useless defense. None of it worked. The plague cut through the Venetian defenses as if they weren't there. The city's own records, clinical and grim, tell the story. The sheer volume of the dead was overwhelming. The traditional funeral rites, so central to Catholic life, collapsed in a day. There was no time for individual masses, no space in the graveyards. The city appointed official gondoliers whose sole job was to pole through the canals, their cry of corpi morti, dead bodies, echoing off the stone, collecting the dead who had been left in the doorways. They were rowed out to new, hastily consecrated islands, the fossa communis or plague pits, where they were dumped and layered with thin coverings of earth. The chroniclers claimed 600 people died every day. The final toll is a historical hypothesis, a grim numbers game. But the most sober estimates suggest Venice lost 50% of its entire population in 6 months. Half the city gone. As Venice was drowning, the plague moved inland, racing along the trade routes of Tuscany towards the region's crown jewel, Florence. If Venice was the world's shipping terminal, Florence was its bank. It was the home of the gold florin, the stable dollar of the Middle Ages. It was a city of bankers, of high finance, of wool merchants, of staggering art and intellectual ferment. And we know, with a terrible literary clarity, exactly what happened there, because it was witnessed by one of the world's greatest writers, Giovanni Boccaccio. His masterpiece, The Decameron, is arguably the most important piece of plague literature in history, and its famous introduction is not fiction. It is a work of masterful, shell-shocked journalism. Boccaccio, writing just a few years later, describes a society that doesn't just fray, but dissolves. He describes the symptom, the gavoccioli, the buboes, that grew to the size of a common apple or an egg. He notes with terror that the disease seemed to leap from person to person, as fire catches onto things dry or greasy when they are brought close to it. But his true focus is the social collapse. He describes a city gripped by a panic so profound that all laws, human and divine, simply cease to function. One citizen, he wrote, avoided another. This terror had struck such dread into the hearts of men and women that brother abandoned brother, uncle, nephew, sister, brother, and very often wife, husband. Nay, what is more and almost incredible, fathers and mothers refuse to nurse and assist their own children. This is the mainstream fact. Florence suffered a complete societal breakdown. The healthy barricaded themselves in their homes, trying to live moderately, only to die alone. Others, deciding the end was nigh, gave themselves over to total debauchery, wandering from tavern to tavern, drinking without limit, and treating all property as communal. The sick, abandoned, died in the streets. The dead, abandoned, rotted in their houses, until the Beccamorti, the gravediggers, drawn from the lowest classes, paid a fortune, and dead within a week, came to haul them away, piling them like merchandise onto carts to be dumped in mass graves. Boccaccio's own father and stepmother died. He fled, and the premise of his Decameron, 10 young wealthy nobles fleeing the city for a country villa to wait out the plague by telling stories, was a literal, real-world survival strategy for the 1%. But this vivid, perfect account also presents our mystery. Was Boccaccio, the literary master, exaggerating? Was he using his incredible skill to create a dark, moralistic backdrop for his stories, a world turned upside down, to justify the flight of his protagonists? This is the Boccaccio question. Some historians argue yes, he was a writer, not a statistician. Other accounts from other cities, particularly drier clerical records, are less dramatic. They list the dead, they lament the lack of priests for last rites, but they don't always describe this total, anarchic, parent abandons child level of moral collapse. The hypothesis is that Boccaccio, while recording the truth of the fear, may have cherry-picked the most extreme examples of human failure to serve his literary purpose. The counter-hypothesis is grimmer, that Florence, a city built on the new proto-capitalist engines of banking, profit, and individualism, was uniquely vulnerable. Perhaps the older feudal bonds of loyalty had already weakened, and when the crisis hit, the cash nexus was the first thing to snap, leaving everyone truly on their own. The inferno that had consumed Florence and Venice was not a localized fire. Italy was the doorway, and in early 1348, the plague kicked that door off its hinges and began its march into the continent. It moved north, and it moved with a chilling intelligence, not randomly, but along the established arteries of human commerce. It traveled by road, by mule track, and most efficiently of all, it traveled by river. From the Italian-Genoese port of Marseille, it found the great aquatic highway into the heart of France, the Rhone. This wide, powerful river was the central trade route connecting the Mediterranean to the north, and the plague-laden boats and barges carrying their invisible cargo of rats, fleas, and sick passengers began their journey upstream. Their destination was one of the most important cities in the world. It was not a capital of kings, but the capital of God's kingdom on earth. It was Avignon. Today, Avignon is a beautiful, walled, provincial city in the south of France, famous for its broken bridge and its sunny charm. In 1348, it was, quite literally, the center of the Christian world. It was the city of the Pope. Due to a complex and bitter political feud with the nobles of Rome, the papacy had abandoned its ancient home. This period, which the Italians angrily called the Babylonian captivity, saw the Pope and his entire vast bureaucracy relocate to Avignon. The city had exploded in size. It was a 14th century Washington, D.C., a single industry town where the industry was the church. It was crammed with cardinals, bishops, priests, lawyers, scribes, petitioners from every corner of Europe, bankers handling the Pope's immense revenues, and all the merchants, artisans, and tavern keepers who lived off them. It was crowded, it was wealthy, and it was, in the spring of 1348, a perfect, condensed target. The man on the papal throne was Pope Clement VI. He was no grim ascetic monk. He was a sophisticated, aristocratic Frenchman, a prince of the church who loved art, music, fine food, and his grand, newly built palace, the Palais des Papes. He was a man of the world, a shrewd politician. And when the pestilence arrived, sweeping up the Rhone Valley, he was one of the very few leaders who seemed to grasp the nature of the threat. even if his understanding was filtered through the lens of miasma. The plague hit Avignon like a thunderclap. In a city so densely packed, the mnemonic and septichemic forms had a field day. The chronicles of the time, particularly from a Flemish cleric named Louis Heiligen, a friend of the poet Petrarch, are pure, breathless horror. He wrote that the disease was so contagious that it was passed not just by speaking to someone, but merely by looking at one another. This was, of course, an exaggeration, but it captures the sheer terror and the incomprehensible speed of the mnemonic spread. The city's complex church bureaucracy, the very thing that made it important, was its downfall. Priests, by definition, could not self-isolate. Their sacred duty was to go to the dying, to hear their final confessions, to administer the last rites. This was a holy obligation, and they fulfilled it, and they died for it. They became the primary vectors, carrying the plague from one deathbed to the next, until they too collapsed. This is the mainstream fact. The clerical death rate in Avignon was catastrophic. Entire monasteries were wiped out, to the last man. The administrative offices of the church ground to a halt as the scribes and lawyers who ran them died at their desks. The death toll in the city was so vast that the very fabric of society tore. The graveyards filled in a matter of days. The traditional sacred rituals of a Catholic burial, the Mass, the Vigil, the procession, all of it was abandoned. There was no time, no space, and no one left alive to perform them. People were dying faster than the living could dig holes, and this led to the single most iconic event of the Avignon plague. With the holy ground overflowing and the unburied bodies piling up in the streets, radiating a stench that the people believed was the plague miasma itself, the city was on the verge of total panic-stricken collapse. Pope Clement VI, facing a crisis that had no theological or political precedent, made a decision of profound desperation and brilliant practicality. He walked from his palace to the banks of the Rhône, and there, in a solemn ceremony, he blessed the river, consecrating its running waters as holy ground. It was a radical, almost unthinkable act, but it meant that the river itself was now a legitimate Christian cemetery. Immediately, the carts that had been queued up outside the full graveyards were rerouted. They were backed up onto the famous Avignon Bridge, and the bodies of the dead, thousands upon thousands of them, were simply tipped over the edge to be washed away by the fast-moving current. It was a river of death, a tragic, necessary, and horrifying solution. This, however, brings us to our great historiographical mystery. How many actually died? The numbers from the 14th century chroniclers are staggering. Louis Heiligen claimed that over half the city's population died in the first 3 months. Another chronicler claimed 11,000 people died in a single 6-week period. These numbers were, for centuries, taken as gospel. But are they true? Or are they a classic case of medieval statistics? Which is to say, not statistics at all, but a literary device. This is the hypothesis. When a chronicler wrote $11,000, he may not have meant a literal counted number. He may have been using the number in a symbolic, biblical way to express an uncountable multitude, a horror beyond normal language. Modern scholars, trying to be more sober, look for administrative records. The best, in this case, are the papal vacantia, the records of church positions, benefices, that had fallen vacant because the priest holding them had died. The spike in these records is undeniable, but it doesn't quite add up to the apocalyptic numbers in the chronicles. The scholarly consensus is slowly settling on a more realistic figure, perhaps 40% to 50% of the city. But this academic number somehow fails to capture the human reality. The mystery is whether our sober modern estimates are closer to the truth, or whether the chroniclers, in their exaggerations, were actually capturing a deeper reality of a city that simply ceased to function. As for the Pope himself, he survived. His personal physician, the brilliant Guy de Chauliac, who also caught and miraculously survived the plague, had advice that was, for its time, genius. He diagnosed it correctly as two diseases, one with buboes and one with coughing and spitting of blood. He recognized contagion, and he ordered the Pope to do what no one else could: isolate. Clement VI retreated into his private chambers. He saw no one. And on his doctor's orders, he sat, even in the blistering heat of the Provençal summer, between two enormous roaring fireplaces. The goal, in their miasma theory, was to purify the air. The actual effect was to create an intense, dry heat bubble that fleas could not tolerate, and that would have desiccated any airborne pneumonic droplets. It was a 14th century biological containment field. It worked. The Pope lived, a lonely, terrified prisoner of his own throne, while his city and his church were washed away into the Rhone. The river Rhone, which Pope Clement VI had consecrated as a holy graveyard, did not stop at the walls of Avignon. It was an artery, and it was pumping the infection deep into the body of France. But France was a kingdom already in the grip of a different kind of fever, a kingdom already bleeding. When the Black Death arrived in 1348, it did not find a nation at peace. It found a nation demoralized, impoverished, and reeling from the first brutal chapters of what would become the 100 Years' War. The plague, in this context, was not a singular event. It was an accelerant, a crisis layered upon a crisis, a supernatural terror dropped onto a landscape of very human, very conventional military horror. The state of France in 1348 was precarious. Its king, Philip VI, was on the defensive. Just 2 years earlier, in 1346, the English king, Edward III, had invaded, claiming the French throne for himself. At the Battle of Crécy, Edward's army of common-born longbowmen had done the unthinkable. They had shattered the charge of the entire flower of French chivalry. The French nobility, the warrior class that defined the nation, had been mown down in a muddy field, their expensive shining armor rendered useless by cheap armor-piercing arrows. It was a national trauma, a humiliation that shook the very foundations of the feudal order. Worse, the English had followed this up by capturing the strategic port of Calais, giving them a permanent, hostile foothold on the French coast. France was a kingdom in shock, struggling to raise new taxes, to muster new armies, to comprehend a world where the armored knight was no longer invincible. And it was into this wounded, anxious, and paranoid kingdom that the pestilence made its landings. It did not come from just one direction. It was a pincer movement. While it was marching up the Rhone from the Mediterranean, it was also making a separate seaborne landing on the Atlantic coast, likely in the bustling English-controlled port of Bordeaux, a city rich from the wine trade. France was being invaded from the south by miasma and from the west by ship, and both invasions were moving towards the center. Paris, by the summer of 1348, was the largest city in northern Europe, a sprawling, half-timbered, densely packed metropolis of perhaps 200,000 people. It was the intellectual capital of the world, home to the great University of Paris, whose medical faculty, as we remember, had confidently blamed the conjunction of the planets. Their theories were of no use. When the plague hit the city, it was a fire in a dry woodpile. The city's narrow, filthy, sunless streets, where waste was simply thrown from the windows, became open-air morgues. The chronicler Jean de Venette, a friar who watched from his monastery, wrote with a kind of stunned disbelief. He claimed that 800 people were dying every day. He described the carts that roamed the streets, their drivers calling out for the dead, piling the bodies like bacon. The main cemetery of Paris, the Hôtel Dieu, reportedly buried 500 people a day in mass graves, layered like lasagna, with thin sprinklings of dirt between the dead. The king, Philip VI, fled, as did most of the aristocracy who could. The university shut its doors. The city, the engine of the French state, simply ceased. But the plague's most decisive strategic blow was not dealt in the capital. It was dealt in the south, where the war was still smoldering. The king's son, John, Duke of Normandy, the future King John II, was leading the main French army. He was besieging the English-held castle of Aiguillon, a key strategic fortress. This was a massive 14th century army camp. Tens of thousands of soldiers, mercenaries, servants, and camp followers, all living pressed together in a sea of tents and mud, with sanitation that would be unthinkable. It was, in short, a perfect buffet for Yersinia pestis. The plague hit the camp in the summer of 1348. And it was not a battle. It was a dissolution. The soldiers, watching their comrades sicken and die in a matter of hours from an enemy they could not see and could not fight, did what any rational person would do. They deserted. They fled. The entire, massive, expensive army, the main hope of the French crown, simply evaporated. It melted away into the countryside, and in doing so, the deserters became the plague's most effective messengers, carrying the disease back to their own remote, previously safe villages in every corner of the kingdom. The siege was broken. The French war effort for 1348 and for many years to come was over. It had been defeated not by the English, but by a bacterium. This military collapse is the central mainstream fact of the plague in France. The war just stopped. The English, who had been planning a fresh invasion, were suddenly hit by the plague themselves, which we will come to. Armies could not be mustered, taxes could not be collected, lords could not leave their plague-ridden estates. The Black Death imposed a truce that no papal legate could have ever negotiated. It wasn't a truce of peace, it was a truce of mutual existential horror. The plague struck the royal family itself, killing Philip's wife, Queen Joan of Burgundy, and perhaps most tragically, Bonne of Luxembourg, the wife of his heir, John. The plague, as it turned out, was terrifyingly democratic. A suit of shining armor, it seems, offers zero protection against an aerosolized bacterium. This was the second great humiliation for the chivalric class. First, the longbow, and now a germ. And this leads to one of the great what-ifs of the 100 Years' War, the central historical hypothesis. Did the Black Death, in its own dark way, save France? The kingdom was on the ropes in 1347. It was demoralized, militarily outclassed, and broke. Edward III had the momentum. He was poised to potentially end the war in a single, crushing campaign. But the plague, by hitting all of Europe, and by hitting the logistics of war just as hard as the people, effectively pressed a giant pause button on the conflict. It bought France time. It bought it nearly a decade of breathing room. When the war did resume, it was in a profoundly changed world, a world of labor shortages, new social tensions, and a new, grimmer, less chivalric reality. The hypothesis is that without the plague's grim intervention, the Kingdom of France might well have been fractured and broken by the English in the 1350s. The plague, by nearly destroying everyone, inadvertently saved the French crown. But in 1348, there was no sense of salvation. There was only the sound of the death carts in Paris and the smell of the pyres. And as the plague saturated France, it was already looking for its next target. It had reached Calais, the English port. It had reached the shores of the Channel. It was looking at the white cliffs of an island that thought itself, as islands often do, separate, special, and safe. As the plague solidified its grip on France, turning the kingdom into a charnel house, the people of England watched from across the narrow, protective sleeve of the sea. They were not, in the summer of 1348, consumed with fear of pestilence. They were consumed with pride. Their king, Edward III, was the hero of Crécy. Their longbowmen were the most feared soldiers in Christendom. They had a permanent, victorious foothold in Calais. They were, they felt, a chosen people, a nation ascendant, protected by God and by the 21 miles of water that separated them from the collapsing continent. They heard the rumors, of course, stories from merchants and priests of the pestilence that was devastating the weaker, more sinful French. But it was over there. Sickness, like invasion, was something that was supposed to be stopped by the Channel. This national sense of detachment, this island-bred illusion of safety, was shattered in the late summer, likely around August of 1348. The traditional story, the one that has become the patient zero narrative for England, points to a single, small, unassuming port on the Dorset coast, Melcombe Regis, today part of the larger town of Weymouth. It was a busy, but not enormous, harbour, its main business being the import of wine from the English-held territories in Gascony around Bordeaux, and trade with the Channel Islands. A ship, the story goes, drifted into the harbour. Perhaps a ship of Gascon wine, or perhaps a ship of terrified English merchants fleeing the inferno that Bordeaux had become. The sailors were sick, the port officials let them dock, and the seeds of the pestilence, as one chronicler put it, were sown on the shores of England. This is the mainstream fact. The plague, known in England not as the Black Death, a much later name, but as the Great Mortality or the Great Pestilence, began its English journey on the south coast in late 1348. From Melcombe Regis, it did not move like a wave. It moved like a fire leaping from tree to tree. It followed the trade routes, the cart tracks, and the footpaths inland. It spread with a speed that baffled and terrified a population that was 90% rural. It wasn't just a city disease. It seemed to appear in isolated, tiny, middle-of-nowhere villages, as if it were falling from the sky. This, of course, is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the human vector hypothesis. A single wool merchant, feeling unwell, could carry his infected lice from Dorset to his home village in Somerset, and in doing so, create a new, distinct outbreak 50 miles away. By autumn, the plague had reached the great port of Bristol, which it devastated. By November 1st, 1348, it had been spotted in London. The city's authorities having heard the news from the West Country, had tried in vain to implement quarantine measures, ordering the streets to be cleaned and rakias to be employed to clear the filth. But London was a 14th century catastrophe waiting to happen. It was Europe's northernmost megalopolis, a crammed, chaotic, and unimaginably filthy square mile of perhaps 80,000 people. It was a city of wooden tenements, thatched roofs where rats loved to live, and narrow, dark alleys where the gong farmers, the men who emptied cesspits, did their work. The Thames was both the main source of drinking water and the primary sewer. It was, in short, a bacterial paradise. When the plague hit London in the cold of winter 1348-1349, it did so with a ferocity that surpassed even the horrors of Paris. The cold weather, which should have slowed a purely rat-flea-based disease, did nothing. This suggests the pneumonic airborne form was rampant, passed from person to person in the cold, smoky, crowded houses where entire families slept in one room. The city's ancient parish churchyards, the small plots of holy ground around each local church, were overwhelmed in a matter of days. A contemporary chronicler wrote that the living were scarcely sufficient to bury the dead. The normal, dignified process of death, burial, and remembrance simply ceased. The city's response was one of desperate, large-scale crisis management. A new plague pit was hastily established. The Bishop of London bought a plot of land called No Man's Land near Smithfield, just outside the city walls. It was consecrated, and the bodies began to arrive. They were not in coffins. They were in carts, piled 5 or 6 high. Contemporary accounts describe trenches being dug, massive, long, deep trenches where the dead were laid in rows, layer upon layer, just as in Paris, with only a slight scattering of earth between them. Later, archaeological excavations at this Smithfield site confirmed the accounts. They found skeletons, thousands of them, stacked with a chilling, logistical precision, all aligned in the same direction, all victims of a single catastrophic event. The sheer number is staggering. One chronicler claimed 200 people were buried per day at Smithfield alone, a number that sounds like an exaggeration until the archaeology proved the hole was, in fact, big enough to hold them. King Edward III, who had been celebrating his victories at Crecy, saw his kingdom dissolve. He wrote a letter, frantic and desperate, to the Archbishop of Canterbury, begging him to order processions and litanies to appease the wrath of God. He cancelled the session of Parliament. His own daughter, Princess Joan, who was travelling through plague-ridden Bordeaux to marry a Spanish prince, caught the disease and died alone in a small French village. The King of England, the master of the longbow, was as helpless as any peasant. This brings us to the great mystery of the English arrival. Was Malcolm Regis truly patient zero? The chronicler who named it, a monk at Malmesbury, was writing after the fact. It's a neat story, a tidy narrative of a single point of failure. But the historical hypothesis that has gained ground is that this is a convenient fiction. The plague almost certainly did not arrive in a ship. It arrived in many ships. England's trade with the continent was not a single thread. It was a vast, messy web. Ships from plague-ridden Calais were arriving in Dover. Ships from the infected ports of Normandy were arriving in Southampton. And ships from Bordeaux, the epicenter of the French Atlantic outbreak, were arriving not just in Melcombe, but in Bristol, Exeter, and perhaps even directly into London. The plague, therefore, probably had multiple simultaneous entry points. It didn't spread from Malcolm. It erupted in a dozen coastal towns at roughly the same time, in the late summer and autumn of 1348. The Great Mortality wasn't a single fire spreading from a spark. It was a coordinated, multi-front, amphibious assault, and the English, with their proud island defenses, had been looking the wrong way. The channel hadn't been a wall, it had been a highway. By the time the spring of 1349 arrived, the disease was loose everywhere, from the cliffs of Dover to the valleys of Wales, and it was racing north towards the separate, unsuspecting kingdom of Scotland. The Great Mortality, as the English called it, had firmly established its beachhead. By the spring of 1349, it had saturated the south of England, consumed London, and was now radiating outwards, marching with grim, unstoppable progress into the Midlands, towards Wales, and north, towards the separate kingdom of Scotland. The Scots, hearing of the foul pestilence that was destroying their ancient English enemies, reportedly gathered their armies, believing the English were weak, afflicted by the vengeance of God. They assembled in the forest of Selkirk, preparing to invade, only to have the plague find them in their own camp, scattering their army before a single arrow was loosed. But the plague's northern ambitions were not limited to the island of Britain. It was now looking across another, much wider and colder sea, the North Sea. Its next target was Scandinavia. The kingdoms of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were, in the 14th century, at the very edge of the map. They were sparsely populated, rugged, and defined by the sea. Norway, in particular, was not a country in the modern sense. It was a long, impossibly jagged coastline, a thin thread of civilization clinging to the edges of vast, empty mountains and fjords. Its towns were small, and its highways were the sea routes plied by trading ships, connecting the small fishing villages to the main port of Bergen, and connecting Bergen to the wider world, especially to England. This maritime connection, Norway's lifeline, was about to become its doom. The mainstream fact is that the plague arrived in Norway in the summer of 1349, and it almost certainly came from England. The trade in timber, fish, and most importantly, wool, was constant. A ship laden with English wool for the Norwegian market would have sailed from a port like London or King's Lynn, both of which were raging plague infernos in 1349. And it would have brought with it the same deadly cargo: the rats in the hold, the fleas in the wool bales, and the sick men in the crew. This is where the historical record blurs, and one of the most powerful and enduring legends of the Black Death is born. This is the story of the Pest Skipet, the ghost ship of Bergen. The story, recorded in Icelandic annals, as so much of Norway's history was, is chilling in its simplicity. One day, in the summer of 1349, a large English wool ship was seen drifting towards the harbour of Bergen, Norway's capital and largest city. It moved sluggishly, its sails ill-trimmed. Like the ships at Messina, it did not respond to hails. The harbour authorities, curious and perhaps suspicious, rowed out. They found a ship of the dead. The entire crew, to a man, was dead, their bodies lying where they had fallen on the decks and in the rigging. The ship was a floating coffin. The townspeople, horrified but also practical, saw a ship laden with a cargo of immense value. Wool was the gold of the 14th century. Bravely, or perhaps foolishly, a small group of men rowed back and began the grim task of unloading the cargo, bringing the valuable bales ashore before the ship was lost. As they worked, they unwittingly unleashed the plague's vectors. Within days, the men who had unloaded the ship were the first to die. From them, the plague exploded into Bergen, and from Bergen, it took to the sea again, carried by local fishing and trading boats up and down the coast, penetrating every fjord, every remote, isolated fishing village. This is the great mystery of the Norwegian plague. Did this really happen? Is this a literal, journalistic account of a single, horrifying event? Or is it, like the catapults of Kaffa, a perfect dark allegory, a folk memory that condensed the arrival of the plague into one unforgettable cinematic image? The truth is almost certainly the latter. It is highly unlikely that one ship arrived with everyone dead. A septicemic or pneumonic plague might kill a crew in weeks, but it's more likely that several ships arrived from England that summer, each with a sick or dying crew, each contributing to the outbreak. The ghost ship story is the summary, the mythic patient zero that captures the essential terror of the plague's arrival. That it came from the sea, that it came from their friends in England, and that it arrived in the very wool that was the basis of their economy. The impact on Norway was, if anything, more catastrophic than anywhere else in Europe. This was not a densely populated country like France or Italy. It was a nation built on a small, fragile population base, and it was cold. The plague's ability to tear through Norway in the dead of winter is, once again, a powerful argument for the pneumonic and human louse vector models. The disease didn't need rats. It just needed people huddled together for warmth in smoky, windowless longhouses. The mortality rate is a matter of grim academic debate, but the most common estimate is that Norway lost between 60% and 70% of its entire population. It was a demographic collapse from which it would not recover for centuries. The social and political consequences were permanent. The Norwegian nobility, the landowning class that ran the country, was effectively wiped out. They were a small group to begin with, and they died at the same rate as the peasants. The church, the only other source of literate administrators, was gutted. With no one left to rule, the Norwegian state simply ceased to function. The kingdom, which had been a proud, independent Golden Age power in the Viking era, became a hollowed-out, empty shell. Within a generation, the crown passed, through a series of marriage alliances, to the Danish royal house. This wasn't a conquest. It was a political vacuum. Norway, emptied by the plague, was absorbed into the Kalmar Union, and it would not regain its full independence for over 400 years. The plague had, in a single year, erased a nation. From Norway, the pestilence moved on, crossing the land borders into Sweden, where King Magnus II would write desperate letters blaming his people's fashionable, sinful, pointed shoes for angering God. It crossed the Kattegat Strait into Denmark, completing its conquest of the north. The Yersinia pestis bacterium, which had begun its journey in the warm grasslands of the steppe, had now proven it could thrive in the frozen darkness of an Arctic winter. The map of the great mortality was, by 1350, a near total wash of black. From the harbors of Sicily to the frozen fjords of Norway, from the wineries of Bordeaux to the gates of London, it seemed that no part of the European known world had been untouched. The pestilence had a horrifying, almost supernatural ability to find humanity, no matter how remote. And yet, the map was not uniform. If one were to shade it by mortality rates, it would not be a solid color. it would be a mottled, complex, and deeply mysterious pattern. Amidst the vast swathes of 50% and 60% loss, there were pockets, islands of apparent salvation, regions that, for reasons that still animate historical debate, seem to have been passed over. The plague, it seems, did play favorites. The most famous, and perhaps the most complex, of these spared lands was the Kingdom of Poland. While the German states of the Holy Roman Empire to its west were convulsing in the flagellant frenzies and the horrific Jewish massacres, Poland, under its wise and aptly named king, Casimir the Great, remained an island of relative calm. Its story for centuries was told as a simple miracle, that the king, a great builder and lawgiver, had acted decisively. He had, the story went, sealed the kingdom's borders, shutting the gates to all trade and travel, effectively quarantining his entire nation. And it had worked. While the rest of Europe died, Poland, safe behind its locked doors, was spared. It's a wonderful story. It's a testament to good governance. And it's almost certainly not the full truth, or even the most important part of it. This mainstream narrative of a spared Poland has, under modern scrutiny, begun to unravel, replaced by a far more complex and interesting mystery. The reality is that Poland was hit by the plague. We have records of it, but it was not devastated. It did not collapse. The mortality rate was significantly lower, perhaps 20% to 25%, a horrific number by any modern standard, but a rounding error compared to the 60% of Tuscany or Norway. The mystery then is not, why was Poland spared, but why was Poland so much more resilient? The answer has little to do with a single dramatic royal decree. It has everything to do with demographics and dirt. Poland in the 14th century was, in almost every way, the exact opposite of Italy. It was the wild east of Europe. It was not a land of crowded, ancient, stone-built cities. It was a land of forests. It was sparsely populated, overwhelmingly rural, and its cities, like Krakow, were modest, young, and made mostly of wood. It simply did not have the population density. Italy was a dry forest of tinder. Poland was a damp swamp. The plague, which thrived on the close, constant, rat-infested contact of a city like Florence, found its job much harder in Poland. Villages were separated by miles of dense forest. Travel was slow. Trade networks were thin and localized. The plague, which, as we've seen, traveled at the speed of human commerce, found itself slowed to a crawl. Furthermore, Poland's population was already growing in a way that Italy's was not. Casimir the Great had an open-door policy, actively encouraging immigration, particularly of German settlers, and most famously, of Jewish communities fleeing the pogroms in the West. This creates a fascinating and complex demographic puzzle. The hypothesis is that this constant flow of in-migration acted as a kind of demographic counterbalance. The plague would arrive, kill a percentage of a village, and then, a few years later, that empty land would be backfilled by new settlers. The net demographic shock was therefore cushioned. The legend that Jewish communities were spared due to better hygiene, a story that was tragically used against them in Germany as proof of their guilt, is largely a myth. Their resilience in Poland was not due to hygiene, but to the fact that they were new, arriving in fresh, uninfected communities. And their population numbers were part of a rising tide of immigration that helped the kingdom as a whole absorb the blow. But perhaps the most dramatic and less mysterious example of a spared land wasn't a kingdom at all. It was a single city, Milan. Milan, one of the largest and wealthiest cities in northern Italy, a rival to Florence itself, should have been doomed. It was a dense, packed, urban metropolis. When the plague arrived at its gates in 1348, its rulers, the formidable Visconti family, did not pray, and they did not consult the astrologers. They acted with a speed and a totalitarian brutality that would have been impossible in Boccaccio's more republican Florence. The Visconti's response is the stuff of grim legend. The moment the first few cases were identified in a house, the city's soldiers were dispatched. They did not take the sick to a hospital. They did not quarantine the healthy. They sealed the house. They bricked up the doors and the windows, entombing the entire household, the sick, the healthy, the children, the servants, inside. They were left with their own dead, to either perish of the plague or eventually of starvation. It was an act of almost unimaginable cruelty, a human sacrifice on a small scale to save the whole. And it worked. By cutting off the first embers with such sociopathic precision, the Visconti prevented the fire from ever catching, while Florence dissolved into moral anarchy and lost 50% of its people. Milan remained an island of terrified, brutal, and relative health. Its mortality rate perhaps as low as 15%. A similar story played out in the remote mountain valleys of the Pyrenees, in the small kingdom of Navarre, and in the surrounding Basque country. Here, the geography did the Visconti's work for them. The region was a natural social distancing machine, a series of isolated valleys where each community had little contact with the next. The plague entered, but it found itself trapped in one valley, unable to easily cross the high passes to the next. This, then, is the great historiographical mystery of the spared lands. Were they truly spared? Or does our record of them just make it seem that way? The answer, as we've seen, is a mix. In Poland and Navarre, low population density and geographic isolation were the key factors. It's not that the plague wasn't deadly, it just couldn't travel. In Milan, the answer was human agency, a ruthless, tyrannical, and stunningly effective public health policy that was, in its own way, as terrifying as the plague itself. These exceptions are crucial because they show that the Black Death was not a supernatural, magical, or unavoidable judgment. It was a biological event. It followed rules. It exploited density. It used trade routes. And in the rare case of Milan, it could be stopped, or at least managed, by a human will that was as cold and as impersonal as the disease itself. But for the vast majority of Europe, there was no Casimir and no Visconti. There was only helplessness. And they turned, as all helpless people do, to their experts, the doctors. In the face of a cataclysm that spared only the isolated, the tyrannical, or the lucky, the vast majority of Europe was left with only one question: why? And more urgently, what can be done? They turned, as all societies do in a crisis, to their experts. In the 14th century, this meant two authorities: the Church, who could interpret the will of God, and the physicians, who could interpret the workings of the human body. The Church's response was one of prayer, penance, and processions, which, by gathering large crowds, often made things worse. The physicians, meanwhile, opened their great leather-bound books, consulted the wisdom of the ancients, and proceeded to apply a medical science that was, with the best of intentions, almost perfectly wrong. The 14th century physician was not a fool. He was a highly educated, literate, and often brilliant man who had spent years at university in Paris, Padua, or Bologna. The problem was not his intelligence, it was his operating system. He was working from a playbook that had been written over 1,000 years earlier by the Greek physician Galen, who had himself been building on the ideas of Hippocrates. This was the doctrine of the four humours, a theory as elegant, complex, and comprehensive as it was fundamentally incorrect. It held that the human body was a microcosm of the universe, governed by four essential fluids: blood, hot and wet; phlegm, cold and wet; yellow bile, hot and dry; and black bile, cold and dry. A healthy person was one in whom these four humours were in perfect, harmonious balance. Sickness, therefore, was not an invasion from the outside, as our germ theory understands it. It was an imbalance from within. A common cold was an excess of phlegm. A fiery temper was an excess of yellow bile. And the plague? To the medieval doctor, this was a profound, catastrophic corruption of the humours, a putrefaction of the body's internal fluids, likely caused by the other great medical theory, miasma. Miasma was bad air, a poisonous, invisible vapour that rose from rotting matter, from swamps, from unburied corpses, from slaughterhouses, or even from the earth itself after an earthquake. This bad air, they believed, was inhaled, entered the bloodstream, and caused the humours to boil and corrupt. With these two theories, corrupt humours and bad air, as their only guide, all of their treatments, which seem to us like barbaric superstitions, were in fact perfectly logical. Their entire medical strategy was twofold: purify the air and force the corrupt humours out of the body. To purify the air, they did things that engaged the senses. They ordered that great bonfires of aromatic woods, like juniper and pine, be lit in the streets. They rang church bells, believing the vibration would break the poisonous air. And on a personal level, a doctor or a wealthy person would carry a pomander, a small, ornate ball of perforated metal filled with strong-smelling herbs, spices, or ambergris. They would hold this to their nose constantly, a tiny personal bubble of good air to ward off the miasma. This is why doctors advised against bathing. They believed hot water opened the pores, making the body vulnerable to the bad air seeping in. But the real and most dangerous treatments were aimed at the humours. If the body was full of poison, you had to get the poison out. The primary method for this was bloodletting. If a patient had a high fever, the doctor reasoned, they clearly had an excess of hot blood. The logical cure was to remove it. This was done either with leeches, which were applied to the skin, or more commonly, by lancing, where a doctor would make a small cut in a vein, often in the arm, and drain a measure of blood into a bowl. In a patient already suffering from septic shock, whose body was in a desperate fight for its life, this practice was a death sentence. It weakened them, accelerated their collapse, and often introduced new infections. If bleeding didn't work, the doctor would move on to other methods of expulsion. They administered powerful emetics, potions of herbs designed to make the patient vomit violently, expelling the corrupt humours from the stomach. They gave them strong laxatives to purge the bowels. The patient, in their final agonizing hours, was thus being simultaneously bled, purged, and poisoned by their own physician. The one treatment that might have done some good was the surgical one. Some doctors, including the Pope's physician, Guy de Chauliac, advocated for cutting open the buboes themselves, lancing the swollen lymph nodes to let the venom drain. This was, of course, agonizing and often led to fatal secondary infections. But in a few rare cases, this crude surgery, by releasing the immense bacterial load from the node, might have been the very thing that tipped the balance and allowed a patient to survive. This brings us to the great historiographical mystery of the medical response, the flight of the physicians. The mainstream fact, recorded with bitterness by chroniclers like Boccaccio, is that many doctors, upon seeing the plague, simply fled. They refused to nurse and assist their own children, let alone their patients. They were, in short, cowards. But is this fair? The hypothesis is more complex. The doctors were not stupid. They could see that their treatments were not working. They could see that everyone who came near the sick, including other doctors, died. They may not have known why, but they recognized the pattern. They were the first to understand, from grim empirical data, that this thing was contagious. The great irony is that the best and most learned doctors, the ones who had read all the ancient texts, were often the first to flee. They were also the most expensive, and their wealthy clients were also fleeing to their country estates. Guy de Chauliac, who bravely stayed in Avignon, wrote in his memoir that he dared not visit the sick for fear of being infected. He only stayed, he admitted, out of shame, and he caught the plague himself, barely surviving. This leads to a dark, counterintuitive hypothesis. The flight of the best doctors may have actually saved lives. A poor peasant, abandoned by the learned, university-trained physician, was left to the care of a local wise woman or a folk healer whose treatments were gentle, useless herbs, or simply to nature itself. That peasant, by not being bled, by not being purged, by simply being allowed to fight the bacteria with their own immune system, may have had a better chance of survival than the wealthy noble being meticulously, scientifically, and lethally treated by the greatest medical mind in the city. The only good medical advice, it turned out, was the advice to flee. The utter failure of 14th century medicine, its bleeds and its purges, left society with only one effective, medically sound piece of advice. It was the advice that the physicians themselves, as we saw, were the first to take: flee. The Latin phrase cito longe tarde, flee fast, go far, return late, became the unofficial motto of the Black Death. It was the only prescription that worked. But this prescription was not a simple herbal remedy. It was, perhaps, the most expensive and exclusive luxury good in the entire medieval world. It was a cure available only to the 1%. For the vast, overwhelming majority of the population, fleeing was a physical and economic impossibility. For a stonemason, a baker, a weaver, or a tavern keeper, their entire life was the city. Their tools, their oven, their loom, their customers, all were there. To flee to the countryside, with no food, no money, and no destination, was not to escape the plague. It was to choose a different, slower, but equally certain death by starvation or exposure. They were trapped. They were lashed to the mast of their dying cities, forced to watch as the waves of the pestilence washed over them. And so society, which Boccaccio had described as dissolving on a moral level, was first and foremost fractured along the uncrossable lines of class. The wealthy, on the other hand, had options. Their wealth was not in their shop. It was in land, in gold, in rents. And most importantly, they had another place to go. This is the reality behind Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron. The image of those 10 young, refined nobles who retreat to a country villa to tell stories is not an allegory. It is a literal journalistic snapshot of the survival strategy of the elite. As the plague pits in Florence began to overflow, the wealthy families of the city, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Medici, did exactly this. They locked the heavy oaken doors of their city palazzi, packed their finest clothes, their gold, and their most trusted servants, and rode out to their country estates in the rolling hills of Tuscany. Here, in their stone-walled villas, surrounded by their own vineyards and olive groves, they could create a bubble. They could pull up the drawbridge. They could eat their own food, drink their own wine, and breathe, as they believed, the clean, uncorrupted air of the countryside, far from the miasma of the dying city. It was the 14th century version of a billionaire's survival bunker. And it worked. The schism, the poor dying in the streets, the rich telling stories in their gardens, was the defining social reality of 1348. It was a brutal, visible, and unforgettable demonstration of inequality, and it planted seeds of resentment that would bear bitter fruit in the decades to come. But for those who couldn't flee, and for the cities that had to manage the plague, a new idea was being born. It wasn't about running away from the plague. It was about stopping it from entering. This was a state-level, institutional response, and it was born, as so many practical ideas were, in the hard-nosed mercantile port cities of the Mediterranean. The Venetians and their savvy rivals in Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, were merchants, not philosophers. They didn't really care why the plague was happening. They cared about how. And they noticed a very simple pattern. The plague arrived on ships. In 1377, in Ragusa, a law was passed that is, for many, the birth certificate of public health. The city's council decreed that any ship arriving from a plague-ridden area would not be allowed to dock. It would be forced to anchor at a remote, windswept island, and its passengers and crew would have to remain there for 30 days, a Trentino, to prove they were clean. This was a revolutionary idea. It was, perhaps, the first time in history a state had used its power to systematically restrict the movement of healthy people for the good of the whole. Soon, this 30-day period was deemed insufficient. Perhaps after an outbreak, it was extended to 40 days. And the Venetian Italian word for 40 days is 40 giorni. From this, we get our modern word, quarantine. Venice, the queen of the sea, quickly perfected this system. They designated a specific island in their lagoon, Lazaretto Vecchio, Old Lazaretto, as the official permanent quarantine station. Ships from the east would be moored there. The crew and passengers would be taken to the island's hospital, a lazaretto, a name confusingly derived from either Saint Lazarus, the patron saint of lepers, or the biblical story of Lazarus. The cargo, meanwhile, those precious bales of wool, fur, and silk, would be unloaded into vast, airy warehouses. It would be smoked with juniper, doused in vinegar, and aired out for the full 40 days, a kind of material quarantine to cleanse it of its miasma. If at the end of the 40 days, the crew and passengers were still healthy, they were issued a clean bill of health and allowed to enter the city. This is the great mainstream fact. Quarantine was invented by 14th century Italians to combat the plague. But it opens a fascinating historical mystery. Why 40 days? To our modern scientific minds, the number is strangely arbitrary. The bubonic plague's incubation period is, as we know, a mere 2 to 7 days. A Trentino, 30 days, was more than sufficient. Why extend it to 40? Was this a brilliant proto-scientific calculation? Did they run trials? Did they observe, with meticulous pre-modern data, that some cases took 35 or 38 days to appear? The historical hypothesis is, almost certainly, no. The number 40 was not chosen for a medical reason. It was chosen for a theological one. In the 14th century worldview, 40 was not just a number. It was a symbol. It was a holy biblical number, freighted with meaning. It was the number of purification, of trial, and of penance. It reigned for 40 days and 40 nights to cleanse the world for Noah. The Israelites wandered the desert for 40 years. Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai. And most importantly, Christ fasted for 40 days in the wilderness. And the period of Lent, of purification before Easter, was 40 days. The Quarantino was, therefore, not a medical incubation period. It was a religious waiting period. It was a symbolic, spiritual ordeal. The ship and its crew were not just being observed for symptoms. They were being cleansed, in a ritual sense, for the biblically appropriate amount of time. It is one of the most beautiful coincidences in the history of medicine. They chose a number for its deep symbolic and religious power, and in doing so, they accidentally, and with miles to spare, created a time frame that was perfectly medically effective. It was a solution that was entirely right, for entirely the wrong reasons. And it set the new, two-tiered template for survival. The rich would flee to their private villas, and the poor and the traveler would be locked down by the state. For the elite, the answer was the country villa. For the state, it was the quarantine island. But for the vast, terrified majority of Europe, trapped in their dying towns, both of these solutions were impossibilities. They were left with nothing. Their physicians had fled or were useless. Their rulers were in hiding, and their local priests were dying beside them. In this absolute vacuum of authority, with all the pillars of their known world, medicine, government, and even the church, crashing down, the people turned to a final, desperate court of appeal. They would take their case directly to God, and they would do so not with quiet prayers, but with a public, agonizing, and bloody spectacle of extreme penance. This was the flagellant movement. If the quarantine was a rational, if brutal, act of state control, the flagellants were its polar opposite. They were an explosion of grassroots, popular, and hysterical piety. The movement was not new. Small groups of self-whipping penitents had appeared before, during famines or other times of crisis. But the Black Death supercharged this fringe idea into a mass, continent-spanning frenzy. It was born, it seems, in the German lands of the Holy Roman Empire, a region that was, as we'll see, already primed for religious extremism. In 1349, as the plague was peaking, the first Brothers of the Cross appeared. They were organized, disciplined, and terrifying. A typical procession would arrive at a town's gates unannounced. It would be a column of hundreds, sometimes thousands of men, marching in double file. They were anonymous, their faces and identities hidden by hoods or hats pulled low. They were clad in simple dark robes, often marked with a red cross. They sang grim, mournful hymns, Geistlieder or flogger songs, in the vernacular German, not in Latin, a language the people could understand. At their head, they carried crosses and heavy banners, as if they were a new mournful army. The townspeople, starved for any sign of hope, any new form of intercession would flock to the market square. And there the ritual would begin. The men would form a great circle. At the command of their master, they would strip to the waist, revealing the scars from previous towns. And then they would begin. They would process around the circle, chanting, and then lie on the ground, their arms outstretched in the shape of the cross. The master would walk among them, beating them as a sign of their sin. Then they would rise, and they would produce their own instruments of penance, the scourge. This was not a simple whip. It was a heavy wooden handle, from which hung 3 or 4 leather thongs, and each thong was knotted. And in each knot, a sharp piece of metal, a nail, or a shard of iron was fixed. To the sound of their own rhythmic haunting chants, they would begin to beat themselves across their backs, their chests, in a synchronized, ritualized, public act of self-mutilation. They would whip themselves until the blood ran in streams, spattering the town square, spattering the onlookers. They were reenacting the flagellation of Christ, offering their own blood, their own pain, as a vicarious sacrifice for the sins of the world. They believed, with an absolute burning certainty, that the plague was God's wrath, and that the regular prayers of the corrupt church were not enough. Only this baptism of blood, could appease him and save their world. At first, the people were mesmerized. Here, finally, was action. Here was a devotion so profound it was written in blood. The flagellants were welcomed as saints. People would dip cloths in their blood, treating them as holy relics. Women would bring their children to be blessed by them. They would offer the brothers food and shelter. And after performing their ritual for a set number of days, the flagellant procession would move on to the next town, a rolling wave of bloody apocalyptic theater. But this movement, born of desperation, very quickly turned dark. It became a phenomenon unto itself, a kindy mass hysteria that was, in its own way, as contagious as the plague. This is the central historiographical mystery. Was this a spiritual movement or a psychic epidemic? We have other accounts from this era, like the dancing plagues, Tanzwut, where groups of people would begin to dance manically in the streets, unable to stop, until they collapsed from exhaustion. It's clear the psychological trauma of the Black Death was so profound that it was breaking people's minds, shattering the boundaries of rational behavior. The flagellant movement was, perhaps, the ultimate expression of this collective trauma, a ritualized, directed, and weaponized form of mass post-traumatic stress. The movement also became almost immediately heretical. It was anti-clerical. The flagellants had no priests because they despised the priests, whom they saw as weak, corrupt, and useless. Their masters were laymen. They claimed their authority came directly from God in the form of a holy letter, supposedly delivered by an angel, which commanded this new bloody penance. They interrupted church services, drove priests from their altars, and claimed their own blood was a purer, more effective sacrament than the Church's Eucharist. This, to the Pope in Avignon, was a direct existential challenge, and then the movement found its scapegoat. As the flagellants marched through the towns of the Rhineland, their apocalyptic fervor, their search for a sinner to blame, fixed upon the only other in their midst, the Jewish communities. This movement of penance for their own sins twisted into one of violent, murderous blame. The flagellants, it seemed, were the shock troops of a new horrifying wave of anti-Semitism that would sweep through Europe. a darkness that would rival the plague itself. Pope Clement VI, who, as we've seen, was a pragmatic and relatively enlightened man, had had enough. In October 1349, he issued a papal bull, a formal decree condemning the flagellants. He called them a vain and superstitious cult, banned their processions, and ordered the church and all secular lords to suppress them. For the lords, this was a welcome order. These armed, radical, authority-hating mobs were a direct threat to their power. The flagellant movement, caught between the power of the church and the sword of the state, was crushed. It vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared, its leaders rounded up, its followers scattered. It was a spectacular, bloody, and tragic dead end, a testament to a world so broken that it had turned, in its agony, upon itself. The flagellant movement was a bloody, theatrical, and ultimately failed attempt to answer the why of the plague by blaming human sin. But it was an inward-facing blame, a self-mutilation. As the movement was crushed by the Pope, the raw, terrified, and hysterical energy of a traumatized Europe did not simply vanish. It remained a coiled spring of panic, still desperate for an explanation, still needing a scapegoat. And it found one. It was an answer that was simple, evil, and for many, deeply satisfying. The plague, this new theory whispered, was not a disease at all. It was a conspiracy. It was a deliberate, malicious, and coordinated act of mass murder. And the conspirators, the story went, were the enemies of Christ, the strangers who lived among them. But apart from them, the Jewish people. This was not a new hatred. It was an ancient foundational rot in the heart of medieval Christendom. For 1,000 years, the Jewish people had been Europe's institutional other. They were legally barred from owning land or joining guilds. They lived, often by law, in segregated quarters, the Judengasse. They were defined by their different faith, their different customs, and most fatally, by their different economic role. The church forbade Christians from practicing usury, the lending of money at interest. This, however, was the lubricant of the entire medieval economy. Kings needed to borrow money for wars, merchants for cargo, and nobles for castles. This sinful but necessary job was thus forced upon the Jewish community, who were outside the Christian prohibition. This made them the bankers and moneylenders of Europe. It was a role that made a few of them wealthy, but it made all of them envied, resented, and crucially, it made their Christian neighbors their debtors. This simmering, centuries-old resentment of the Christ killer and the usurer was the dry tinder. The plague was the match. The accusation that exploded across France, Switzerland, and the German Rhineland in 1348 was specific and insane. A grand international Jewish conspiracy, supposedly directed by rabbis in Toledo, Spain, had been launched to wipe out all of Christendom. The method? They were systematically poisoning the wells, the rivers, and the springs. It was, of course, a grotesque fantasy. It made no logical sense. But in a pre-scientific world, a world that believed in miasma, the idea of a poison in the air or water was not a great leap. It felt more rational than an invisible, selective judgment from God. And this theory had something the miasma theory did not. It had a face. It had an enemy that could be seen, fought, and punished. All that was needed was proof, and proof was quickly manufactured. In September 1348, in the castle of Chillon, on the shores of Lake Geneva, the local authorities arrested a number of local Jews. Under methods of torture so grotesque they defy description, these individuals were forced to confess. We have the official transcripts. A Jewish physician named Baligny confessed that he and others had received a poison, a powder made of the heart of a Christian, spiders, frogs, lizards, and sacred hosts, from a rabbi. He confessed they had been ordered to sew this powder into small leather bags and drop them into the town's wells. This confession, extracted under agonizing, bone-breaking pain, was immediately, eagerly, and officially copied. It was sent by messenger from Shiom to the surrounding towns, and from those towns to others, as a bulletin, an official report. This was the 14th century version of a viral, deadly piece of fake news. The effect was instantaneous. The confessions from Shillong provided the legal justification for what the terrified mobs already wanted to do. The massacres began, and they were not, we must be clear, chaotic riots. They were systematic, organized, and bureaucratic acts of extermination. The most infamous and best documented took place in the free and prosperous city of Strasbourg in February 1349. The plague had not even reached Strasbourg yet. The city was, so far, completely healthy. But the fear of the plague and the news of the well-poisoning plot had. The town's leaders, the Meister, were actually models of reason. They argued publicly that they had no evidence that the Jewish community was as ever peaceful and that they should be protected. But this rational stance enraged the rest of the city, particularly the powerful trade guilds. This is where the mask of piety slips and the hypothesis of raw, cynical greed emerges. The Strasbourg guilds were deeply, profoundly in debt to the city's Jewish moneylenders. The well-poisoning plot was not just a threat. It was an opportunity. It was a pious way to default on their loans, to clear the ledgers by killing the creditors. The guildsmen rose up, staged a coup, and overthrew the city council. The Meister who had defended the Jews were run out of town. The new radical guild-led council set the date for the massacre, February 14th, St. Valentine's Day. What happened next was a cold-blooded, pre-modern Einsatzgruppe. The entire Jewish community of Strasbourg, some 2,000 men, women, and children, were rounded up and marched to their own cemetery. There, a massive wooden platform had been constructed. They were forced onto it. Those who resisted, or who tried to convert to Christianity at the last minute to save themselves, were dragged away. The rest, the majority of the community, were locked onto the platform as the crowd, led by the flagellants, who had conveniently arrived in town, looked on. The platform was then set on fire. It was a single, massive, public execution, a holocaust in the literal fiery sense of the word. The city council, its work done, then passed a decree. All debts owed to the murdered were cancelled, and their property was divided among the burghers. This scene was repeated, with local variations of horror all across the Rhineland. In Basel, the community was rounded up, locked inside wooden houses on an island in the Rhine, and burned alive. In Frankfurt, Mainz, Cologne, the same. The great ancient Jewish communities of Germany were being systematically, totally erased. The one voice of sanity in the madness was once again Pope Clement XVI. He was horrified. In July 1348, and again in September, he issued 2 papal bulls. In them, he flatly, angrily, and publicly condemned the massacres. He stated the obvious, that the Jews were dying of the plague just as much as the Christians. He pointed out that the plague was raging in lands, like Hungary, where no Jews lived. He declared that anyone who blamed them was seduced by that liar, the devil. He ordered all clergy to preach this, and for all secular lords to protect their Jewish subjects. It was, perhaps, his finest moral hour, and it was a total failure. This is the great mystery. Why? Why did the Pope, the supposed vicar of Christ, have zero authority? The hypothesis is that his words were simply a whisper in a hurricane of terror, greed, and century-old hatred. The Pope was a distant political figure in Avignon. The flagellant, with his bloody scourge and his apocalyptic, anti-Semitic screaming, was right there in the town square. And the lure of cancelling one's debts was a far more powerful, tangible gospel than a piece of parchment from a corrupt French pope. The authority of the church on the ground had broken. The pogroms were a complete, catastrophic failure of both state and religious control. The Black Death had unleashed a second parallel plague, a pestilence of human-made hate, and its mortality rate for its chosen victims was 100%. The pogroms and the flagellant processions were a fever, a hysterical, violent reaction to the plague's peak. But like any fever, they eventually broke, not because they were cured, but because the plague itself, having consumed so many, began to wane. By 1351, the first great wave, the great mortality, was burning itself out. The bacteria had simply run out of new, non-immune hosts to infect. And as the screaming of the flagellants and the crackle of the pyres faded, they were replaced by something far more profound and far more terrifying. It was the sound of silence. It was the sound of a world that was suddenly, shockingly, and almost completely empty. The Black Death was, at its heart, a logistical crisis, not of food or of armies, but of bodies. The 14th century world was built, from its deepest theology to its daily customs, around the sanctity of the individual death. When a person died, a complex and non-negotiable ritual began. The body was washed and wrapped in a shroud by the family. A priest was called to administer the last rites. A bell was tolled. A requiem mass was sung. A coffin was built. A procession was held. And the body was laid, alone, in a consecrated individual grave in the parish churchyard. A grave that would be tended and visited. This was the good death, the ars moriendi. It was the guarantee of a proper Christian journey into the afterlife. The plague did not just mock this ritual, it annihilated it. The sheer, relentless volume of the dead broke the system on the first day. There were no priests, because the priests, in their dutiful visiting of the sick, were often the first to die. There were no carpenters, for they were dead or had fled, and wood was impossibly scarce. There were no family members to wash the bodies. Boccaccio's father-abandoned son was a literal reality. The bodies, left in the houses, began to putrefy, and the survivors, driven by fear of the stench, which they equated with the miasma itself, had only one goal: to get the body out. This created a new, terrifying profession: the beccamorto, the gravedigger. In England, they were called corpse haulers or rakers. These were men, and sometimes women, from the absolute lowest rungs of society, or perhaps criminals offered a pardon, or simply those who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. They were paid an astronomical wage for a job that was, in effect, a death sentence. They would roam the streets with handcarts, their faces often masked with vinegar-soaked rags, their voices hoarse from the only cry that mattered, "Bring out your dead." And the healthy, barricaded in their homes, would open their doors just wide enough to push the blackened, swollen body of their husband, wife, or child into the street, to be hooked or grabbed and piled onto the cart with the others. The final destination for these carts was the Fossa Communis, the plague pit. The parish churchyards had filled in a week. The authorities, those few who were left, had to act. In London, as we saw, they bought the field at Smithfield. In Paris, the Hôtel Dieu dug massive trenches. In Avignon, they used the river. This was the mainstream fact, the physical scar left on the landscape. These were not graves. They were mass disposal sites. The chroniclers, from Boccaccio in Florence to Jean de Venette in Paris, all used the same chilling metaphor. The bodies were layered like lasagna, a layer of corpses, a thin sprinkling of dirt, another layer of corpses, another thin layer of dirt. They were, Boccaccio wrote, piled up like merchandise in a ship's hold. The individual sacred death was gone, replaced by the crushing, anonymous logistics of waste management. This visual, olfactory, and spiritual horror of the mass grave is what created the psychological state of the survivors. They were not lucky. They were traumatized. They were living in a ghost town. They woke up to a world where the church bells were silent. Many bishops forbade them, as the constant tolling was driving the survivors mad with panic. The workshops were closed. The fields were fallow, the grain rotting on the stalk, the livestock wandering untended. The world was empty. And this brings us to the single greatest and most unanswerable historiographical mystery of the Black Death. How many? How empty, really? The chroniclers of the time were not statisticians. They were traumatized men trying to express the inexpressible. When Jean de Venette says 800 people a day died in Paris, he was not consulting a ledger. He was communicating horror. When other chroniclers claim a third of the world died, or scarcely 1 in 10 survived, they are using biblical, apocalyptic language to say a number so vast, I cannot count it. For centuries, that 1/3 figure, about 33%, was the accepted number taught in schools. But it was, in effect, a medieval guess. How then do modern historians, from the safety of our own century, try to find the real number? The answer is a kind of forensic accounting. We cannot count the dead, but we can count the living, before and after. The first tool is tax records. A king or a great lord knew exactly who lived on his land because he taxed them. The manorial rolls of England are a perfect example. A record from 1347 will list all the tenant families in a village. The record from 1351 for the same village is a document of ghosts. We can see, name by name, who is gone. And in village after village, the number is not 33%. It is 40%, 50%, 60%, sometimes even higher. The second tool is church records. While we don't have death certificates, we have the vacantia, the record of empty church positions. We can track, month by month, how many priests, abbots, and bishops died. In England, the death rate for the clergy, the frontline workers of their day, was around 45%. The third tool is wills and testaments. In a city like London, historians can count the number of wills filed for probate. In a normal year, it's a steady, predictable trickle. In 1349, it becomes a flood. The records show a 2,000% increase in wills being filed, a desperate, panicked rush of the dying trying to settle their affairs before the end. This is the great hypothesis that has emerged from this data. The one-third figure is almost certainly a massive underestimate. The true mortality of the first wave, from 1347 to 1351, was likely closer to 50% to 60% of Europe's entire population. In 4 years, a bacterium killed 1 out of every 2 people. The population of Europe, which had stood at around 80 million, was reduced to perhaps 30 or 40 million. It was a demographic cliff, a great culling that has no parallel in human history. It was not a plague. It was a species-level event. And the survivors, the 50% who had, by pure genetic or geographic luck, made it through, now stood in the echoing silence of this new, empty world. And they were, without realizing it, suddenly rich. The survivors of 1351 stood blinking in a world that was no longer crowded. They were the 50%, the ones who, by pure dumb luck, had drawn the winning ticket in a lottery they never wanted to enter. At first, the feeling was not one of relief, but of profound echoing shock. The silence was the most deafening part. The church bells were still, the street cries of the merchants were gone, the workshops were shuttered. And in the countryside, the fields were vast, overgrown, and empty. The harvest of 1349 had simply rotted on the stalk. The harvest of 1350 was barely planted. The world was quiet, and it was wild. For the lords, the bishops, and the kings, the survivors of the elite who had huddled in their castles or country villas, the first cold panic must have been political. But the second, far deeper panic was economic. Their wealth, their entire world, was based on a single, simple pyramid. A vast, broad base of peasants who did all the work, supporting a tiny, pointed cap of nobles who did all the ruling. The system was called serfdom. A serf was not a slave to be bought and sold, but he was not free. He was tied to the land. He was, in effect, a piece of farm equipment that came with the property. He could not leave his lord's manor. He could not marry without his lord's permission. He did not typically earn a wage. He paid his rent by working the lord's personal fields, his domain, for free, several days a week, and by giving the lord a large, fixed percentage of whatever he managed to grow on his own small allotted patch of dirt. This system worked, and had worked for centuries, because of one simple, brutal imbalance. There was not enough land, and there were too many people. The peasants, desperate for a place to farm, had no bargaining power. The Lord held all the cards. The Black Death took that deck of cards and threw it into the fire. In the new empty world, the equation was flipped with a violence and a totality that is almost impossible to comprehend. Suddenly, there was not a shortage of land, there was a surplus of it. Entire villages, entire valleys were now empty, the fields to let to anyone who wanted them. And there was a catastrophic, desperate, screaming shortage of people to work it. The power, for the first time in 1,000 years, was not with the man who owned the land. It was with the man who could work it. A serf in 1351, let's call him William, who had survived while his lord's other 20 peasant families had been wiped out, would have had a moment of profound, terrifying realization. The Lord needed his grain harvested. The Lord could no longer force him to do it. What if he didn't? What if he just walked away? His lord's neighbor, whose own manor had been completely emptied, would pay anything for a strong back. He would offer him freedom. He would offer him more land. He would offer him cash. This was the Great Revolution. The peasants, for the first time, began to vote with their feet. The old bonds of serfdom, the ties of villanage, simply evaporated. A lord who insisted on the old ways, who demanded free labor, would wake up one morning to find his entire workforce had vanished in the night, gone to a neighboring estate that was offering double the wages. This is the mainstream fact. The Black Death did not just weaken serfdom. In most of Western Europe, it killed it. It was the birth of the free waged laborer. The peasants who remained demanded and received hard cash for their work. And with a 50% drop in population, the price of that labor went through the roof. Chroniclers of the time write with aristocratic, spluttering rage about this new world. They complain that a simple farmhand now demands more per day than a knight. They write of the arrogance of the commoner, who, with this new disposable income, was suddenly eating better food, meat and cheese, not just gruel, drinking ale, and most offensively of all, wearing finer clothes, silks and furs that were supposed to be reserved for the nobility. The very structure of the world, the three estates, those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, was collapsing into a fourth estate of a wealthy, uppity, and dangerously confident peasantry. The elite, of course, did not take this lying down. Their response was not to adapt, but to legislate. They would, they decided, make this new reality illegal. In England in 1351, the government, run by the king and his noble council, passed the infamous Statute of Labourers. It was a law born of pure, aristocratic panic. It attempted to do two things. First, it made it illegal for any employer to pay more than the customary, i.e., pre-plague wage. Second, it made it illegal for any peasant to demand more. It literally froze wages in the year 1346. It was, in effect, an attempt to make the laws of supply and demand illegal. It was, of course, a catastrophic, immediate failure. It was the single most unenforceable law in history. A lord, watching his unharvested grain, his entire year's profit, rotting in the fields, was not going to quibble over a law when a laborer demanded an extra penny. He would pay it, and he would pay it under the table. The only thing the Statute of Labourers accomplished was to fill the newly empowered peasantry with a cold, slow-burning rage. It was a visible, legal, and insulting demonstration that their lords, their betters, saw them as nothing more than tools, and were willing to use the law to put them back in their box. This brings us to the great historical hypothesis, the one that defines the post-plague world. For decades, the great popular uprisings that followed, the Bloody Jacquerie in France in 1358, and most famously, the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, were seen as revolts of pure, downtrodden despair. But this is the new theory. They were not. They were revolts of rising expectations. The rebels of 1381 were not the starved, beaten-down serfs of the Great Famine. They were their grandsons, the new, waged, empowered, proto-middle class. They had tasted freedom. They had tasted prosperity. And when the government, in 1380, tried to impose a new poll tax, a flat tax on every single head, rich or poor, it was the last straw. They revolted, led by men like Wat Tyler, not for bread, but for liberty. Their famous slogan, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" was not a cry of hunger. It was a radical, political, and post-plague demand for total equality. The Black Death had not just emptied the world, it had turned it upside down. The survivors of the great mortality, those who had walked through the fire and emerged on the other side into the strange, quiet, and newly prosperous world of the 1350s, were, in their own way, a new kind of human. They were the inheritors of an empty earth. They were, as we saw, richer. They were freer. They were the traumatized but empowered beneficiaries of a demographic catastrophe. And as the decade wore on, as the plague pits were crossed over and the empty houses were reoccupied, a cautious, fragile sense of normality began to return. Life, as it always does, found a way. People got married, often to other survivors, combining the lands they had each inherited, and inevitably, they began to have children. This new generation, born in the 1350s, was precious. They were the boom that followed the bust, the living proof that the world was not, in fact, ending. They were the heirs to all this empty land, the future of this new post-plague society. For 10 years, Europe breathed a shallow, guarded sigh of relief. The plague had been a conjunction of the planets, a corruption of the air, a divine judgment. But it was, crucially, a singular event. It was over. They had lived through it. They had survived. And then, in 1361, it came back. This return was, in its own way, a psychological blow more cruel and more profound than the first. The first wave had been an apocalypse, a swift, fiery, incomprehensible reaping. This second wave was a calculated, personal, and targeted act of malice. It was the moment Europe learned that the plague was not a one-time event. It was not a judgment that had been passed and served. It was a new, permanent fact of life. It was a monster that was not gone, but had merely been sleeping. And now it had returned. This second pestilence, as it was called, was not as widespread as the first. It moved more slowly. The mortality rate for the total population was lower, perhaps only 10 to 20%. But it had a new, terrifying, and heartbreaking characteristic, one that was noted with a unique horror by chroniclers all across Europe. The English called it the mortalité des enfants, the French, the pestilence des enfants. In Latin, the pan-European language of the Church and the chroniclers, it was the pestis puerorum, the plague of the children. This is the mainstream fact. The 1361 outbreak, and many of the subsequent smaller waves, seemed to disproportionately, and with a terrible precision, target the young. It scythed through the generation of children who had been born since the great mortality. A friar in England, John of Reading, wrote with a new kind of despair. He noted that the disease chiefly affected the young and the wealthy, sparing the poor and the elderly. A chronicler in Avignon, where the papal court had once again been decimated, noted the same thing, that it carried off in great numbers children and young people and nobles. The horror of this cannot be overstated. The first plague had stolen the past. This one was stealing the future. The survivors of 1349, who had endured the unendurable, who had rebuilt their families and their farms, were now forced to stand by, helpless, and watch their new children, the reason for their rebuilding, die of the same familiar, agonizing sickness. The black buboes, the fever, the delirium. It was all back. But this time, it was not taking their aged parents or their weak neighbors. It was taking their healthy, precious, and irreplaceable children. This new wave also seemed to hit the nobility, the wealthy, with a strange vigor. This was particularly true in England, where the plague of 1361 ripped through the aristocratic houses that had, through their isolation, perhaps dodged the worst of the first wave. It claimed the lives of Henry, Duke of Lancaster, one of King Edward's most brilliant commanders, and of numerous other great lords and ladies. This, of course, presents us with the central agonizing mystery of the second pestilence. Why? Why this new cruel focus on the young and the noble? Was this a new strain of Yersinia pestis, one that had mutated and developed a new, sinister preference? Or was something else at play? The most logical and most widely accepted hypothesis is a simple, modern, biological one: immunity. The survivors of the 1347-1351 wave, the adults of 1361, were, by definition, the lucky ones. Many of them had likely been exposed to the plague, had a mild, non-lethal case, and had recovered. Or perhaps they were the possessors of some, as yet unknown, genetic quirk that gave them a natural resistance. They were, in short, a hardened population. Their immune systems had seen this enemy before. But the children, the generation born after 1351, had not. They were a naive population. Their immune systems had no memory of the bacterium. When the plague returned, it did what any pathogen does. It followed the path of least resistance. It bypassed the immune adults and found a vast, easy, and tragically vulnerable new food source in the bodies of their children. This immunity hypothesis also explains why the nobles were hit so hard. Remember the flee fast, go fast strategy. The wealthy in 1349 had been the most successful at isolating themselves in their country estates. They had dodged the plague, but in doing so, they had also dodged the chance to build up any immunity. In 1361, they were, immunologically speaking, just as naive as the children. And when the plague returned, it came for them too. But there is another, more subtle hypothesis. It suggests that the pestis puerorum wasn't, perhaps, biologically different, but perceptually different. This is the observation bias theory. Think back to 1349. In that first great apocalyptic wave, everyone was dying. Children, adults, the elderly, men, women. They were all being piled into the same mass graves. The death of a child, while tragic, was just one more death in a mountain of death. The chroniclers, in their stunned shock, wrote of the total collapse, not of specific demographics. But in 1361, the scene was different. The adult survivors, the immune ones, were not dying in large numbers. Suddenly, the only people dying, or the majority of the dead, were the children. The deaths, therefore, became infinitely more visible, more shocking, and more worthy of specific, horrified comment. It wasn't, perhaps, that only children were dying, but that their deaths were no longer masked by the deaths of everyone else. Whichever hypothesis is true, the effect was the same. The Black Death was no longer a single historical event. It was now endemic. It had settled into the soil of Europe. It became a permanent, recurring feature of life, a childhood disease that would return with a sickening, predictable regularity every 10 to 15 years. 1361, 1369, 1374, on and on for the next 300 years. It became the great, dark engine of late medieval and early modern life, a stop-go cycle of trauma and recovery that shaped everything. It created a world of profound pessimism, a world where you never got too attached to your children because you knew, with a dark certainty, that the plague would likely return for them before they reached adulthood. This was the true legacy of 1347. Not just the empty world, but the permanent, terrifying, and cyclical shadow that would hang over it For centuries, the plague, by returning, had changed its very nature. It was no longer a historical event. It was the weather. It was a permanent dark cloud in the human sky, a cyclical storm that returned every decade to cull the young, reminding the survivors that the world was not and would never again be a safe or predictable place. This constant, looming, and entirely arbitrary threat of sudden death hollowed out the very soul of late medieval Europe. It created a new, collective, and profound obsession. It was a culture fixated on the one thing that truly mattered: mortality. The high medieval mind, the mind that built the soaring, light-filled cathedrals of Chartres and Amiens, had been a mind of confidence, a mind focused on a glorious, ordered salvation. The post-plague mind was different. It was darker, more cynical, more morbid. It was less concerned with the glories of heaven and far, far more obsessed with the physical, democratic, and grotesque process of dying. This trauma, this cultural shell shock, needed a language, and it found it in one of the most powerful and enduring artistic tropes in history: the danse macabre, the dance of death. This was not a single painting, but a new genre, a virus of an idea that spread across Europe, painted on the walls of churches, in monasteries, and in public squares. It was a public, constant, and grim reminder. And its message was, like the plague itself, brutally simple and terrifyingly universal. The danse macabre is a procession, but it is not a procession of the living. It is a conga line of the living and the dead, chained together. In a typical depiction, a series of human figures representing every single step of the 14th century social ladder are shown, and each one is being led, pulled, or mocked by their new partner: a grinning, desiccated corpse, or a gleeful, capering skeleton. The skeleton, the personification of death, does not care about your earthly status. In fact, it finds it hilarious. The procession begins at the top. Here is the Pope, his triple tiara askew, his hand of blessing ignored, as a skeleton mockingly pulls him along by his rich vestments. Next is the Emperor or King, his crown falling from his head, his scepter useless, as a corpse fiddles with his ermine robes. Here is the Knight, his armor clattering, his sword in its sheath, as a skeleton leads him away, helpless as a child. Here is the wealthy merchant, his bag of gold coins spilling onto the ground, but he cannot stop to pick them up, as death has his arm. And on it goes. The bishop, the abbess, the lawyer, the musician, the beautiful maiden, her fine dress in tatters, her face a mask of horror, as a rotting corpse embraces her. And crucially, at the very end of the line, the peasant, his plough abandoned, the beggar, his bowl empty, and most poignantly of all, the small child, often shown as a baby, being scooped up from its cradle by a skeletal arm. This was the core message of the danse macabre. Death is the great leveler. The plague, which had so effortlessly breached the walls of the Pope's palace in Avignon and the King's castle in London, had proven, in a way no sermon ever could, that worldly power was a total, ridiculous illusion. The dance was a piece of social satire, a grim, sarcastic commentary on a world that had, as we saw, just discovered the arrogance of the newly wealthy peasant. This art was the great memento. "You can wear your new silk robes," it whispered, "but the skeleton beneath is the same." This general theme of memento mori, remember you must die, was not limited to these great public frescoes. It became a deeply personal, almost grotesque fascination with the physicality of decay. This gave birth to one of the most shocking and revealing art forms of the era, the transitum. This is the great mainstream fact that illustrates the new mindset. Before the plague, a wealthy noble's tomb was a gesant. It was a serene, idealized effigy. The knight would be carved in his shining armor, his hands in prayer, his dog at his feet, looking as noble and perfect as he did in life, waiting peacefully for the resurrection. After the plague, this was no longer enough. It felt like a lie. The transi or cadaver tomb was invented. This was often a double-decker tomb. On the top slab, just as before, would be the idealized effigy of the cardinal, the duke, or the bishop, carved in all his earthly finery. But below it, on a lower slab, visible to everyone who walked by, was a second carving. This one was of the same person, but as they would be a year after burial, a hyper-realistic, horrifying sculpture of a rotting corpse. The flesh is shown sloughing off the bones. The burial shroud is pulled back to reveal a body crawling with carved stoneworms, snakes, and toads. It is a portrait of pure, unadulterated putrefaction. The inscription, often carved in stone between the two, would read in one form or another: "As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you shall be." This brings us to the central historical hypothesis, the psychological mystery of this art. Why? Why this descent into what seems to us to be a culture of pure, morbid, self-torturing horror? Was Europe simply traumatized into a collective depression? The hypothesis is that this art was not just an expression of trauma. It was a desperate attempt to control it. The true horror of the Black Death, remember, was not just the death. It was the impersonality of it. It was the arbitrariness. It was the sudden fever, the delirium, the loss of self, and worst of all, the anonymity of the plague pit. It was the bad death, the malamors, with no priest, no rites, no grave. This new morbid art was a psychological defense mechanism against that chaos. The Danse Macabre, by showing death as an orderly single-file procession, was an attempt to put order back into the chaos. The transitum, by forcing the viewer to confront the most graphic realities of their own decay, repersonalized death. It took it back from the anonymous pit and made it yours again. This obsession even spawned a new genre of literature, the ars moriendi, or the art of dying. These were, in effect, the first how-to guides for a good death, woodcut illustrated books that walked the reader through the 5 temptations the dying would face: lack of faith, despair, impatience, spiritual pride, and avarice, and how to defeat them. It was a script. It was a way to regain agency in a world where the plague could take you at any moment. This art and literature was a way for the individual to reclaim the final act of their own life, to stare putrefaction in the face, and to, in their own way, get the last word. The morbid, fatalistic art of the Danse Macabre was not a fleeting trend. It was the new normal for a world that had accepted the plague as a permanent resident. The Pestis Puerorum of 1361, that cruel plague of the children, had set the pattern for the next 3 centuries. The Black Death was no longer a single, cataclysmic storm. It was the monsoon season. It returned again and again, every 10, 15, or 20 years. A new wave of death that washed over Europe, finding the new generation of non-immune children and teenagers. It became a dark, cyclical, and entirely predictable part of life. And this long, slow 300-year war of attrition, this second pandemic that began in 1347, would only truly end after two final, spectacular, and horrifying outbreaks, one in the north and one in the south. These were the plague's grand, terrible farewell performances. The Great Plague of London in 1665 and the Great Plague of Marseille in 1720. By 1665, London was a city that had, in some ways, learned nothing. It was no longer the 80,000 person town of 1348. It was a sprawling, booming, half-million person metropolis. But it was still a city of narrow, filthy, overcrowded, timber-framed tenements, its sanitation still medieval, its streets still awash in waste. When the plague returned that hot, dry summer, it found a tinderbox just as ready as the old one. The story of this outbreak is a mirror, a dark echo of the great mortality 300 years earlier. But we see it with a new, terrifying, and personal clarity through the eyes of a new kind of witness, the diarist. Men like Samuel Pepys, a rising, ambitious naval administrator, recorded the horror, not as a distant chronicler, but as a terrified resident. The mainstream facts are all too familiar. It began in the poor, crowded suburbs. It exploded in the heat. The wealthy, including King Charles II and his court, did exactly what Boccaccio's nobles had done. They fled. Pepys wrote in his diary of the melancholy in the city, of the coaches piled high with the belongings of the rich streaming out of the gates. He wrote of the red crosses now being painted on the doors of the infected with the desperate, heartbreaking plea, "Lord, have mercy upon us." This was the Milanese system, but adopted too late, and with a terrible addition. The entire healthy family would be locked inside with their sick and dying members. A watchman posted at the door to ensure their 40-day sentence was served. It was a death sentence for the whole household. Pepys, walking through a silent, miserable London, wrote of the plague with a fiery breath rushing into every corner. The death toll, tallied in the new bills of mortality, reached 7,000 per week. The plague pits were dug again. The total loss was 100,000 people, a quarter of the city's population. This London outbreak is famous for its ending. Just a year later, in 666, the Great Fire of London ripped through the same medieval center of the city, burning the timber-framed houses to the ground. This created one of history's most enduring and popular just so stories. That the fire cleansed London, that it burned out the plague, the rats, and the filth, and in its ashes, a new, clean brick and stone city was born, ending the plague in England for good. But is this true? This is the great historical hypothesis. The fire undoubtedly did help. It was a massive, if accidental, act of urban sanitation, destroying the old, rat-infested wooden slums. But the mystery is whether it was the decisive blow. The plague was, in fact, already waning before the fire ever started. The bills of mortality for late 1665 and early 1666 show the numbers were in sharp decline. The fire was, perhaps, simply the final nail in a coffin that was already being sealed. The plague's true last gasp in Western Europe came 55 years later, in Marseille, 1720. And this story is not a mystery. It is a tragedy of human greed. The city of Marseille had, like Venice, a formidable, state-of-the-art quarantine system. But in May 1720, a single ship, the Grand Saint-Antoine, arrived from the Levant, a plague hotspot. On its voyage, several sailors had died of a fever. The ship was, by law, doomed to the 40-day quarantine. but its cargo of silks and cottons was fabulously valuable, and its owner, a merchant named Jean-Baptiste Estelle, was also one of the city's deputy mayors. He pulled strings. He pressured the city's health board. He claimed the deaths were from bad food, not plague. He got his cargo released early to be in time for a major trade fair. Days later, the porters who had unloaded the bales were dead. The plague, Yersinia pestis, was loose in Marseille for the last time. It was an exact repeat of 1347, a perfect, tragic bookend. The city was consumed, losing 50,000 people, half its population. But this time the response outside the city was different. The French state, now a powerful, centralized 18th century monarchy, did what no medieval king could have. It enacted the Milan model on a national scale. The French army was mobilized. They built a 6-foot-high stone wall, the Mur de la Peste, around the entire infected region of Provence. This cordon sanitaire was 100 kilometers long, guarded by thousands of soldiers with a single brutal order. Anyone attempting to cross it, in either direction, was to be executed on the spot. It was the most perfect and most merciless quarantine in history. And it worked. The plague raged in Provence, but it could not get out. It burned itself out, trapped, having finally met a human will as ruthless as its own. This, then, is the greatest mystery of all. Why did the Black Death, the second pandemic, finally end? For centuries, the popular theory was the rats. That the domestic, human-loving, ship-climbing black rat, Rattus rattus, was, in the 18th century, outcompeted and replaced by the larger, meaner, but crucially shyer brown rat, Rattus norvegicus. The brown rat, the theory goes, prefers to live in sewers and riverbanks, away from humans. The bridge for the flea was broken. It's a neat, elegant theory. But the timelines are messy. The truth is likely a combination of factors, but the strongest hypothesis is that the plague didn't go away. It was kept away. We won. We won not through medicine, which was still useless, but through the brutal state-sponsored perfection of quarantine, the cordon sanitaire, and the total militarized control of human movement. We had, after 300 years, finally learned to build a wall that the plague, which relied on human travel, simply could not climb. The plague still existed. It was raging in Russia, in the Ottoman Empire, but it was now, for the first time, held at bay from Western Europe, a prisoner of its own biology, defeated by the very thing that had made it strong, its reliance on us. The great cordon sanitaire, built around Marseille in 1720, was a wall, and it held. Western Europe, for the first time in over 300 years, could finally breathe. The cyclical, terrifying second pandemic was over. The plague was gone. It had, it seemed, been defeated by the new, centralized power of the 18th century state, by human will, and perhaps, as the popular theory went, by the ascendance of the new, sewer-dwelling brown rat. The 19th century, the great age of industry, steam, and rationalism, dawned with a new, unmedieval confidence. The Black Death was a horror, but it was a horror for the history books. It was a Gothic tale of a dark, superstitious, and thankfully distant past. But the plague was not gone. It was not defeated. It was merely asleep. It was biding its time, ticking over in its ancient quiet reservoirs in the high steppes and remote mountain valleys of Asia. It had never left its homeland. And in the mid-19th century, in the isolated, rugged province of Yunnan in southwestern China, a new set of human actions, a massive Muslim-led uprising called the Panthay Rebellion, the subsequent troop movements, and the chaos of war once again disturbed the delicate balance between the local marmots, their fleas, and the human population. The ancient ghost, the Big Bang of Isikul, had a new 19th century echo. This new outbreak, which we now call the third pandemic, began slowly. It smoldered in the Chinese interior for decades, moving along the rivers and trade routes, until, in 1894, it reached the world's new, supercharged global artery, the British port of Hong Kong. Hong Kong was the new Kaffa. It was the new Messina, but its galleys were not slow-moving, wind-powered wooden ships. They were fast, efficient, coal-powered steamships, capable of crossing the world's oceans in a matter of weeks. And from this single, crowded, and now pestilence-ridden port, Yersinia pestis did what it had always done. It found the ships, and it went global. This third pandemic, carried by steamship, reached every inhabited continent. It spread to India, where it would kill over 12 million people. It spread to Australia, to South Africa, to South America. And most famously, it crossed the Pacific, arriving in 1899 in the harbor of San Francisco, beginning the plague's first and only foothold in North America. But this time, humanity had a new weapon, a tool that the doctors of 1347 or 1665 could not have dreamed of: germ theory. Thanks to the revolutionary work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, the world finally knew that disease was caused by invisible, living microorganisms. The miasma theory was dead. The bad air had been replaced by the bacillus. And when the plague exploded in Hong Kong in 1894, the world's greatest scientific minds knew exactly what they had to do. They had to find the killer. This brings us to one of the great races in the history of medicine. The terrified British authorities in Hong Kong sent out a global call for help. Two rival teams representing the two great superpowers of 19th century microbiology arrived almost simultaneously. From Japan, representing the German Koch school, came Kitasato Shibasaburo. He was a brilliant, established star, a student of Robert Koch himself, well-funded and equipped with the latest, most advanced laboratory equipment. From France, representing the Pasteur School, came Alexandre Yersin. Yersin was the opposite, a young, quiet, almost reclusive field agent, a student of Louis Pasteur, with meager funding and a small portable lab. The race was on. Kitasato, with his official backing, was given access to the main plague hospital. He got to work immediately, performing autopsies, and he focused logically on the blood of septicemic plague victims. He quickly found a bacterium. He announced his discovery, publishing his findings first. He had, it seemed, won. Yersin, meanwhile, was the outsider. He was locked out of the official hospitals. Undeterred, he resorted to bribery. He paid British sailors to let him into the makeshift plague huts, where he would, in secret, perform his own autopsies. But Yersin had a different, crucial insight. He believed the blood was the wrong place to look. It was too full of other contaminating bacteria. He believed the factory of the disease, its true home, must be the bubo. This is the mainstream fact. Alexandre Yersin, in a small makeshift lab, lanced a fresh bubo from a recently deceased victim. He drew out the thick, yellowish pus, smeared it onto a glass slide, and put it under his microscope. What he saw was not a mix of bacteria. It was a single, pure, unmistakable, teeming, an almost pulverulent mass of tiny rod-shaped organisms. He had found it. His next step was genius. He saw the streets of Hong Kong were, just as in 1347, littered with the bodies of dead rats. He captured a sick one, performed an autopsy on it, and found its own swollen lymph nodes. He put the fluid from the rat's bubo under his microscope, and he saw the exact same, identical, teeming mass of bacteria. It was the eureka moment, the connection that had eluded humanity for 500 years. The same killer was in the rat, and it was in the man. The disease was a zoonosis. He had solved the Black Death. This, of course, creates our historical mystery, the Kitasato Yersin controversy. Kitasato published first. So why is the bacterium not named after him? The hypothesis, which is now the scientific consensus, is that Kitasato, for all his brilliance, was wrong. The bacterium he described in his initial hasty paper was not the plague bacillus. His samples, drawn from septicemic blood, were likely contaminated with pneumococcus, another common bacterium. His description of the organism he found was vague and did not match what we now know. Yersin's paper, published a few days later, was perfect. His description, his method, the bubo, his staining techniques, and his crucial identification of the same bacillus in the rodent reservoir were all correct. The scientific world, after decades of debate, agreed. The discovery was Yersin's, and the killer of 1347 finally had its modern scientific name, in honor of its discoverer, Yersinia pestis. The ghost had been caught, identified, and named, and the 500-year-old mystery was, at last, solved. The ghost, after 500 years, finally had a name. The discovery by Alexandre Yersin in that sweltering makeshift lab in Hong Kong was the great turning point. It was the moment the Black Death passed from the realm of supernatural terror, from a miasma or a judgment, into the realm of the knowable, the finite, and the treatable. The third pandemic, which Yersin's discovery helped contain, was met not with flagellants, but with quarantine, with flea control, and within a few decades, with the miracle of antibiotics. Today, Yersinia pestis is still very much with us, living in its wild reservoirs, but it is no longer an apocalypse. A case of bubonic plague, if caught early, is curable with a simple course of streptomycin or doxycycline. We had, it seemed, finally and definitively won. But the story of the Black Death, the second pandemic, the 300-year reign of terror from 1347 to 1720, was not just a historical event. It was not just a story of art, economics, or religion. It was, first and foremost, a biological event. It was, perhaps, the single greatest, most brutal, and most efficient agent of natural selection to ever be applied to the human species in recorded history. For over 3 centuries, it scoured Europe, returning every decade to cull the non-immune, the unlucky, and the susceptible. The question that hangs over our modern, post-plague world is, therefore, a profound one. Did it change us? Did that 300-year crucible, which killed 1 out of every 2 people, leave a permanent, visible, and functioning scar, not just on our culture, but on our genes? This is the mainstream fact, the biological certainty. The 50% to 60% of Europeans who survived were, in some cases, just lucky. They were the isolated, the quarantined, the ones who fled to the country villa. But it is a statistical impossibility that all of them were just lucky. There must have been, scattered in the population, individuals who survived because their unique genetic makeup, their specific immune system gave them some small, crucial, life-saving advantage. They survived, they had children, and they passed that advantage on. The plague was a filter, and it slowly, relentlessly enriched the European gene pool with whatever protective quirks it could find. We, the people of European descent, are the children of these survivors. We are the inheritors of their luck, and perhaps of their genes. This then leads to one of the most fascinating and debated hypotheses in modern science: the hunt for the plague's genetic scar. And the most compelling suspect is a tiny, specific, and seemingly unrelated mutation known as CCR5 delta 32. To understand it, we must think of our immune cells, our white blood cells, as tiny fortresses. On the surface of these cells are many doors, or protein receptors. One of these, a protein called CCR5, acts as a door handle. And it is this exact door handle that a modern-day plague, the HIV virus, uses to grab onto, unlock, and invade our immune cells. This is where the mutation comes in. A small percentage of the human population has a tiny genetic typo, a 32-letter deletion in the gene that codes for this door handle. This is the delta 32 mutation. If you inherit this mutation from both parents, about 1% of Europeans, your immune cells simply fail to produce this door handle. The HIV virus, when it enters your body, finds a fortress with no doors. It cannot get in. These people are, in effect, naturally highly resistant to HIV infection. If you inherit the mutation from only one parent, about 10–15% of Europeans, you simply have fewer door handles, and the HIV infection progresses far, far more slowly. Here is the profound mystery. This mutation, this HIV resistance gene, is not evenly distributed. It is found almost exclusively in people of European descent. In populations from Africa and Asia, it is virtually non-existent. This is a blazingly obvious clue. A random mutation might pop up anywhere, but for it to be at such a high frequency, 10–15%, in one specific population, it must have been selected for. Something in Europe's recent past must have come along and killed a massive number of people without this mutation, leaving those with it to survive and reproduce. The hypothesis is almost too perfect, too poetically neat. The something that came for the Europeans, and only the Europeans, was the Black Death. The theory is that Yersinia pestis, or perhaps another great killer of the era, like smallpox, also in some way used the CCR5 door handle. In the great, horrific lottery of 1347, those random few who, by pure chance, had this broken door handle had a slightly better chance of survival. They were more likely to live, to marry, and to have children, to whom they passed this broken gene. And when the plague came back in 1361 and 1374, and on for 300 years, this broken gene was selected for again and again, becoming more and more common in the surviving population. And so here we are, the great cruel irony of our own DNA. A tiny lucky typo which may have given our ancestors a fighting chance against the great bacterial plague of the 14th century, now by pure beautiful evolutionary coincidence, gives their descendants protection against the great viral plague of our own time. The story of the Black Death, then, is not, in the end, a story from the past. It is not just a tale of ghost ships and beak masks and strange morbid art. It is a story that is still happening inside of us. It is written in the legal DNA of our wills and our labor laws. It is written in the cultural DNA of our art and our concept of social equality. And it is, perhaps, written in the literal biological DNA of our cells. The plague pit at Smithfield, the cordon sanitaire at Marseille, the empty manor in the English countryside, all of it is still here. The ghost of 1347 never left. It just became a part of us, a silent, microscopic, and for some, a deeply protective shadow, whispering in our very blood. The world was remade. The people who survived, and their children, and their children's children. They were the new world. A world that had faced the end and had somehow found a new and emptier and stronger beginning. And now, it's time to rest. The bells are quiet. The streets are empty. The world is, at last, at peace. And you can finally just sleep.